Okay, so thank you for that, David. That was a lovely introduction. It's a very strange experience to do a presentation about language when you're listening to translations of your language and then imagining back what that sounds like to everybody else. I think this has become so metacognitive already that I'm starting to hurt a little bit. I notoriously put too many slides together when I do workshops. In this case, I took the view that if I'm speaking too quickly, which I notoriously do, and if we're translating across from English to Italian, that some meaning may be lost and that I can't see you, so I'm not exactly sure where to pitch some of my information. So these slides hopefully will be able to, if I skip some, it's because of timing and I feel like the point has been made. I hope the point has been made, but you can always go back and read more or less what I've written in a way that is almost quite sequential. So I hope that helps, especially in this forum where we don't have the same sort of feedback. I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to assume that you can see my slides. I'm not sure if you can. I might just bring those up. Can I just confirm with somebody that you are seeing my slides right now? Simon, can you tell me if you, yeah? Great, fantastic. Okay, I'm quite happy for questions to be asked throughout, given that we don't have visual feedback, and I will try to make it as interactive as I can as a process. Quick background on me. I won't spend too much time on this. When I read these numbers, I realize I'm getting old. I've been doing ABA programs as a clinical psychologist for just over 20 years now. We think the other day we calculated I've probably written programs for about 1,000 children over those years. Some of those I started with at 3 and now 23, and they visit me. Some of them visit me to critique my early programs. They tell me what they think I got wrong, which is a wonderful experience. I also, though, run a clinic here where we don't just work with children with developmental delays or autism, but we also run a clinical program. So we work with children with all sorts of, well, I cautiously use words, but such as ADHD, your oppositional defiance, anxiety, trauma. We work with child protection. We work with children that have suffered neglect and abuse. And we work with the children's court and the family court here. So we have a clinical program and a forensic program that's quite large. I don't see these programs as separate. They fit each other, they feed each other, and they inform one another. One of the most important things that's been that I would like to communicate is very early on when I started working in ABA, my attraction to it was very much the precision, the fact that I could work with the child and I could see evidence of learning that I was measurable, it was operationalized, and I could make clear decisions and essentially be confident I was making a difference. What I quickly came across, though, was the challenge of human development wasn't necessarily addressed by ABA. ABA gave me tools for analysis. It didn't necessarily tell me what I was aiming for. It told me that I needed to promote development, and there were ways to do this, but it didn't necessarily readily tell me what development was or what I'm trying to achieve. Am I trying to get rid of symptoms? Am I trying to empower speech? What is the goal? And very quickly, it became apparent that I needed to be able to address a much more complex question, which is what is human development? And ABA and the question of what is human development have never been separate for me. RFT was a necessary bridge to put those two things together. I couldn't do it with ABA alone. That was satisfying in terms of the challenges that the human condition created or prompted in terms of my analysis. And that was very apparent in my clinical program. So what I'm hoping today to do is give you a moderately deep dive into what our program looks like now, having done 20 years of this, and how RFT changed how everything looked. It may not look that different to you in some ways. Some of these may be really obvious to you, some of it may not be, but it allowed the human challenge or the question of human development to be answered in ways that I wasn't able to do when I was thinking from a purely Skinnerian perspective, from a purely as I was trained in the 3-term contingency, or even the 4-term if we're doing verbal behavior. So I've tried to summarize this in this slide here, that what we're going to try to do in the first half of today, if I can keep to time. The unique challenge that really can't be dodged when we talk about humans is there seems to be 4 interlinked, but I'm going to separate them for this discussion, key points that we must, if we choose to accept that these are key parts of being a human being. The first one is to accept that we are an incredibly social species. There is something quite unique about just how social we are. There are other mammals that are social, but we are social to a level which I will show you soon, that says that there's something in that, in our development, that we must attend to. There's something quite unique about how social we are, and it gives us an evolutionary advantage, but it seems to have other things. We have a symbolic capacity, which means we can conceptualize existence well beyond our senses. We can think of the future and the past. We can imagine possibilities. We can have discussions like I'm having right now. I can't see any of you. We are throwing words across the divide using symbols. I am doing this in English. Poor old the translators, Cecilia and Simon, are trying to translate my words into Italian, and that is landing in your particular history of your mind and being turned into whatever images you're getting. That is unique to us, and its capacity is unparalleled. Related to that is we seem to have this other capacity, which is we're generative. We seem to be able to take on information and become explosive with it. And when it gets explosive, this is where, and you know, normally I would talk when I do workshops, and the crowd, we may share some jokes and humor about some of the funny things kids say. But the reality is, when you start getting symbolic, you start seeing these generative things coming out in children, which can be quite funny. You know, they can be entertaining to watch the stereotypes pop out of their head. It can be interesting to watch how quickly we lose control of them. I suddenly look at them and I don't know how they learned that. I just know that it went in there from some experience. They walked past the kitchen, dad said something to mum, that word got into the child's ear, bounced into some sort of network of history, and before you know it, he's come out with all these other things. I can give you one of my favorite examples of this process is my own daughter. When she was 4, and we watched we were just before bedtime, and there was a World Vision advert came on about people in Africa starving. It was the first time she'd ever seen this. It stopped her, and she asked why they were starving, and whether we were giving money and what we could do, why they didn't just go to the shops to get food, or why didn't they fly to Australia. And we talked her through it, we explained it, and we told her we were already donating, but we promised to donate in her name. So she went to sleep, we donated in her name. About a year later, at the table, she remembered this conversation, and she said to me, "Dad, you did donate, didn't you?" And I said, yeah, we donated in your name. You donate to World Vision in Africa for those starving kids. And she'd watched this vehemently, and she'd watched this incredibly detailed advert that went for like 2 minutes. My memory, it was Ethiopia, but it may have been Sudan. And then she looked up and she said, "So they're getting our money?" And I said, yeah, Remy, they're getting our money. And she said, "Okay, are they white yet?" And of course, in her mind, the reason, because it dawned on me where we live, that there actually, well, to the best of my knowledge, there were no African kids or Aboriginal kids. Aboriginal kids are more up north from where we live. And as a result, there were no dark-skinned people in her class. She's, I think, pre-primary at that stage. And in her mind, the reason they were dark must have been because they were starving. So she derived that white people must be healthier because they've eaten. Now that's generative. That's well beyond anything. That's a whole bunch of words that Remy put together and reached that conclusion. And it's not illogical. And we've got Facebook and social media is full of these funny stories of kids doing things like this. This is a capacity that if early intervention is done well, this is what early intervention does. You lose control of your learner. I don't want to know where your ideas come from. I want to be surprised by them. Now, the last part, and this is where the clinical world runs into the developmental world, is we seem to be able to create meaning. Well, we can create meaning. We can self-regulate. We can put up with pain for the sake of something greater. We can go beyond the physiological condition that says that what we're doing right now is wrong or unhealthy or unhelpful. When we go to the gym, we experience pain. We imagine a future self that makes it worthwhile doing. These are unique abilities that we have as a species. That also means that that symbolic ability, that generative ability, has allowed us to again even leave these interoceptive senses, these meaningful experiences, and create meaning for ourselves. Now, those four things summarize the human condition to me, and they summarize the challenge for early intervention. We're not trying to teach skills, we're trying to meet those four things, and they're interrelated. And when I first started in my career 20 years ago, and we had a book called the Maurice and Green book, it was a black and white book, and we had a recipe more or less. Everyone did matching, everyone did imitation, everybody did receptive labeling, and the receptive labeling was just person behind who hand over hand prompted the person when we said get the cup, get the ball. It was very much like that, and it worked. But we never got the really generative outcomes, at least not intentionally. We never got the symbolic experience, not intentionally. We could get it accidentally, but we never got it intentionally. And we definitely never thought much about the social aspect. There was something missing. We couldn't get to those perspective-taking questions, those mind questions, like how do you create a future self? How do you create a past self? We just didn't get into those questions. And that's where it was necessary to look into RFT. Well, I knew about naming theory and I knew about stimulus equivalence. I just couldn't get into all these advanced concepts that I wanted to discuss about the human condition without RFT. And RFT seems to address those big 4 points. And I think what the exciting thing about RFT is it really highlights point number 1. You're not getting symbolic if you're not social, if you're not cultural. And we see increasingly in philosophy of mind research and philosophers who look at cognition, such as Andy Clark and those people, the people like that, where they look at the extended mind hypothesis. Increasingly, they highlight to us thinking of the mind as in the head is naive. The mind is in the culture. It's what connects us all with our symbolics. That's very much where that philosophy is going, and it's very consistent with what RFT says we should be looking for. And what that does is it changes the way EI looks a bit. It changes the way ABA looks at the early intervention programs. It makes us think a lot more about attachment to the symbolic community and how we do that. It makes us think beyond the senses. What is it to abstract from the sensory experience, which we're very good at conditioning, to the symbolic one? What is it to be generative and personalized learning? And lastly, what is it to live in a symbolic reality where we put the self in this story? You know, what is that? And these become goals, and we see them in development, neurotypical development, and there's clues when you look at neurotypical development, when you look through the frame of RFT. So I'm going to jump in and work through this. In the second half, I'm going to give you some applications, examples, and how an ABA program looks different, or at least for us, it looks different. So the first thing I want to highlight is the evidence that we're very social, and that we need in any program to highlight the social aspect before we even get to the symbolic. This is a study done by Tomasolo, and I can't even see my notes, guys, but it's in your slides. The key thing about this is, if you look at this study, these are, from my memory, 2.5, 3-year-old, I think they're 2.5-year-old children. They're up against monkeys or chimpanzees and orangutans. And there's a battery of tests. I think there was 12 cognitive tests, and they can be roughly grouped into spatial reasoning, quantification, causal reasoning, cause and effect reasoning, and social learning. Now, the 2.5-year-old child is doing the tests. The orangutans and the chimps, they're across ages. They can be up to, I think, 20 or 30 years of age. It doesn't really matter that the chimps and orangutans can be older, because we don't see cognitive development continue past about 2.5 for them, which is a key point here. Because when you look at the human, definitely versus the chimps, we're lagging on spatial quantification and causal reasoning. They're actually better than us. Not much, but they're better than us. Now, the orangutan's lagging, granted, but still holding up pretty well. But when you look at the table itself and you look across at social learning, that is an astoundingly bizarre table to look at, or graph to look at. That is an extraordinary thing. Social learning stands out so much, it's kind of silly. And that's the gift. That's the human gift. That big black bar is the human gift. Because you see, that 2.5-year-old child is lagging right now behind the chimps and the orangutans at this point in time. But in 3 months, it's all over. That child, that human is going to be miles ahead in just 3 months. And the reason they're going to be miles ahead in 3 months is because they can learn from their adults. They can learn from peers. They have the capacity to soak up information through social learning. They can do that really dramatically and very quickly. So they accelerate themselves. And there's a clue for us in that, because we are trying constantly to get to that social connection. We can see this in Hart and Risley's research in language. And this is the next part. Not only social modeling, this is imitation learning. They can do it, we can see it with language. The way our parents speak to us, the amount of words they use, has a dramatic effect on the speed in which we develop our vocabulary. That in itself is amazing. And what's really worth noticing is that then we get this acceleration in our curve. When we hit a critical mass of words, we get this acceleration. And that acceleration, something happens that's worth discussing. We're going to get to that, but I'm saying RFT tells you what happens. But you see that acceleration, that expansion, that loss of control of the learner is what we're hunting. Okay, so again, the way we are parented, the way we are given information accelerates our capacity. And we know that this leads to the cognition. We know that the Hart and Risley's own research shows us that when we get this language acquisition speed up, we also get an IQ jump. We get an increased cognitive ability across the board. So there's a piece in this. The social interaction, be it through modeling, and modeling leads to language, and language leads to all these other cognitive benefits, tells us that the social is leading to the symbolic, and it's doing it very efficiently. And there's a lot of studies around. One of them is extended mind work, but I would point everyone towards a lovely book by Cecilia Hayes called Cognitive Gadgets. And it really looks a bit like this. Human beings innately don't have, well, there's mirror neurons we can argue with, but generally do not have, they definitely are not born with joint attention and perspective taking. And most of the imitation array is not present. They definitely do not have language. But when you get those three, you get an acceleration in all the other cognitive skills. Now, where I'm particularly interested in is this one. ABA knows a lot about imitation. Everyone knows a lot about imitation, but this one, this has kind of been a bit of the holy grail. We've been trying to get to this one for a while. And we see it in all sorts of quotes and the like, and I'll go past this quickly, but I think this is probably the best summary I've ever seen of what we're trying to achieve. We know humans are pattern seeking. We know they are sensory. We know that they are always looking at detail. Their brain is looking for anything it can fill in. It is anticipating constantly. That's how illusions work. But we're also storytelling, and we're really adept at storytelling. And the storytelling facility is the bit that is where the symbolic world explodes your generative capacity. And we want to get to that as quickly as we can when we're working with kids. Now, again, I can't see anyone, so I don't know if my pacing is right, but I believe this is one of my favorite examples of explaining that storytelling ability and what it does. One of the great symbolic systems is mathematics. Now, if you look at symbols, just symbols, what it does and how it promotes development, this is an amazing story. The number system was passed on, we think, from the Sumerians to the Babylonians, 300 BC, and there was no zero. There was no zero in that. They had no placeholder that allowed them to readily tell 1 from 10 or 100. They had none of that, okay? The Babylonians passed the system into India through migration. The Indians developed zero, we think, around AD 458. The concept was passed to Europe through conquests in Spain, the Moors, in AD 711. Initially, the Europeans thought zero to be satanic because in their narrative, God was in everything, therefore nothing was the work of the devil. So zero had to be satanic and it held it back. So they didn't get zero, right, for a long time. The population of the world, so this is all just transfer of story. The population of the world in 300 BC was around 150 million people. AD 711, it was around 220 million. Right? Now, think about this. In 300 BC, only a handful of people knew the power of zero, what it could do. Okay, only a handful would have been considered geniuses. They knew what to do with zero, the power it gave them to it with large numbers. In 711 AD, a large part of the population knew nothing of it, and some of the thought leaders in Europe thought of it as evil. Now, in 2021, the population is about 7.6 billion. Zero and place value are taught around the world in every education system that I could find, and are known well by age 6. It is now effortless to to conceptualize zero. Everybody just knows zero. In fact, most people don't know there was a time zero didn't exist. They just live in the world that zero exists. Now, we live in these symbolic realities, and that has to be the challenge when we're looking at functional development. We have to be able to get a person to a point that they can understand how that worked, that they can be symbolic in this way, because that's the power of symbolics. That couldn't have been done through reinforcement learning alone. That had to be transmitted through symbolic processes. Stimulus control transfer couldn't do that. That had to be done symbolically. Now, isn't it a powerful thing when you think that there were geniuses that knew zero, brilliant mathematicians in India and so on, very few of them, and now it's stone cold obvious. Everybody looks at it and thinks, how could you not know? This is the potency of our social symbolic system at work. And when we look in our early intervention programs, we see clues all over the place for this. We're always looking for cusps that promote rapid learning. We're always trying to find this generative goal. We're always trying to find what gives us the bang, what takes and explodes learning. It's not really about skills. It's not about, can you tell me what red is? It's how quickly can you learn what red is? It's not how can you identify I from you? It's how quickly can you use it? How quickly can you acquire it and then explode it into other functions? That's the goal. It's the explosiveness of development that we're always hunting. And it's in all our programs. You can see it in the developmental cusp literature. There's lots. I've put examples here and some circled them for you. You know, if you look at these ones, and it's not explicit, sadly, it needs to be more explicit. But if you look here, you know, novelty, new. The whole idea is, I don't want to know how you learned it. I want the child to come in and go, I know roughly what cognitive ability or what ability was utilized to get that, but I have no idea where it came from. I have no idea how you got it. I have no idea. I didn't in any way plan for it. It's just, I gave you some skills that made the world stickier. And now things are just sticking to it. And that essentially is implied by our programs. We just don't necessarily think of it that way. And we want to be able to do this, like I said, without it being direct. We want to be able to do this. We want to say, I taught you how to learn, not what to learn. It's in the VB map. See, I love the VB map for this one. If you look at this, it shows, here's one of the protocols, shows a response generalization for 5 items, tags the same stimulus with 2 different words, teacher and Katie, cat and Garfield, dog and Maggie. So uses 2 words. My interest in that is, how did the child know those words go together? Were they reinforced to say, you say this, then you say this, because that would be a script? Were they taught through some association, like categorizing? How did they learn it? The issue of that response generalization, yeah, I agree. You know, Sunderberg, I agree. That's a great goal. Response generalization. But the question is, how do we make sure it happens without it being just scripted reinforced learning? Because that's not generative. Okay, we want a child to be able to take off with these things. We don't want to know that we just taught them what to say. We want them to know, we want them to actually find ways to get these words that we didn't explicitly teach them, because that's what development does. And to prove it, and to show you how generative, once we get the symbols are, I would ask you quickly to look at this exercise. If you look at this exercise, there's a tree bending. I've just got this on Google. And I can ask you all these questions. And if we were in an audience, I don't know how many people are at this conference, but if we're in an audience right now and there was 30 people, 40 people, whatever, and I got you all to answer that, most of us are going to come up with different answers, but they'll all be logically correct with the question, as long as we come from the same symbolic community. Why is the tree bending? Why is it happening? Why is this? Why is the tree bending? Why is the wind blowing? Why is the clouds there? What time is it? When will, insert whatever you like, when will the tree break? When will it come back? What is your relation to this picture? What parts make up the things that you see if you're going to break that picture apart? The tree is under what? Or is it on top of what? What is the sky bigger than? Can you see something that is the opposite of the sky? What is not happening in this picture? And what is there in this picture for you to see? Now, you can answer all those questions. We can all answer those questions. We will not necessarily, in fact, it's highly unlikely, well, it's almost impossible to believe that we'd all have the same answers across all those questions. But we can all agree on the logic. So why is the sky, what is the sky bigger than? Okay, well, some would say the clouds, some would say the grass, some would say the tree. the branch, the leaves. Logically, everything I just said is true. You know, biologically, in terms of our shared understanding of the word bigger. But my interpretation may be different to yours just because of what I've learned to focus on with the word bigger. So we can all agree as a culture that I'm right, but not necessarily the same experience of what we're looking at. And that's the personal generative nature of this. And to show you how personal it is, you can then even self-reflect on it. You can go and look at your answers. You can say, what does this tree mean to you? What does it mean to you to see a tree like that? What does it remind you of? Personalize it. But we can go even further. What did your answers mean to you? When you looked at the answers you wrote down, what did they mean to you? What did your answers about your answers mean to you? So you can reflect on your reflections. What did that mean to you? What did that do to you? What did your answers about your answer mean to you from the perspective of a person you respect, or a person you fear, or a person you admire, or compare yourself to? You don't have to ask that person. You can just imagine they exist, which is, of course, the perspective-taking skill. But that's just personalized meaning now, and it's just going on and on and on, and it's an endless loop. Right there, there is no doubt what I've just done is a human experience, and it's all completely doable. We want early intervention. We want ABA. We want all our programs to get to a point where a child looks at that and can answer it. Because if I went back up here, I can see that in reading programs. I can see comprehension programs. I can see where a person reads a paragraph and derives meaning. I can see that in those. I can say, you know, why did the boy go to the beach? What would have happened if the beach was closed? You know, we have inferential questions, we have literal questions, we have prediction questions. These are all in our reading classes, and they're right here. Right? This is all around us, and we want our children to be able to answer them. And I couldn't readily do it with traditional ABA. I had to go to how do those symbolic processes develop, and this is where RFT kicks in. Now, I hope, forgive me, I don't know the knowledge of my crowd, and I have no idea if you've all done RFT. I have no idea how much you all know, so I hope you can indulge me to be a little bit sequential here and just go through what RFT is, and not waste too much of your time in doing so. Okay, so first of all, what is relational frame theory, or derived relational responding, which is what RFT is trying to explain? First of all, it's important to say it's not controversial. It's really not that controversial. It builds on top of the work from stimulus equivalence, which is Sidman's work. It adds new terms and units of analysis because it allows for more extrapolation, okay, and allows for more complex analysis. So we look at entailments rather than just reflexivity and transitivity and the like, okay? We look at entailments as a better descriptor. That doesn't mean that stimulus equivalence has been in any way disagreed with. It's just saying it is a type of frame, it's not the only frame. It is still able to be discussed as an operant. You can still use all the precision that you get with a manipulation of context, because of course the appeal of ABA, I believe for most of us that are behavior analysts, is it allows us to focus our analysis on the context, because we can manipulate context. We can't manipulate brains, we can't manipulate minds, whatever that metaphor may mean. We can manipulate context. We just want to know how to manipulate the context to get outcomes through the adaptive process known as learning. We can still do that with RFT. RFT doesn't sacrifice any of that. I may be allowed to start using more sloppy terminology like work, or how we use working memory. But I can use terms like theory of mind. I can use things like self. I can use things like narrative. I can use things like memory, although I would define it as a form of narrative. All of these things I can bring from the cognitive literature, I can bring from culture, but I can pull it apart now. I can talk about how it was built, and then how I measured it was present, and then how I lost control of it. Because again, if I've done my job well, I lose control of my learner. I don't know where they're going to go next. They just start doing their own thing, which we may refer to as individual personality. I'm going to do this very quickly, guys. Again, I don't know what my crowd's knowledge is. If I'm in Australia, well, in Australia, if I'm talking to Australians, I must make it clear that Australian psychologists don't study behavioral analysis. So I often have to go right back to the basics sometimes of what is a reinforcer. So again, if I'm wasting your time, I apologize, but crash course in stimulus equivalence, easily conceptualized in terms of matching, which most people like to think of, which is visual. I can train an equivalence network or response frame, something like this. I could reinforce a child for matching that picture to the text of the word cat. I could reinforce that. I could then test, but if not, I could reinforce, reinforce the opposite direction. So the cat goes to that. So, sorry, the word cat goes to the picture cat. I can then reinforce meow going to that. I can test, and if not, reinforce that the cat goes to the word meow, which is the opposite direction. Remember, that's reinforced. This is not. If it doesn't appear, I can reinforce it. I can then reinforce, then I can test to see if the child gets meow and cat when I put them up to be matched. So what I'm always doing is testing the derivation, but if it doesn't happen, I reinforce it. So if the child doesn't get meow to cat, I'd reinforce it, and then I'd get cat to meow and reinforce that. Now, the key thing is this. I'm going to go back over this. If a person already has equivalence, when I do that goes to that, they'll do this for free. When I do that goes to that, they'll do this for free. Then they'll do this for free and this for free with no reinforcement. But I know what to do if they fail this. I just reinforce it. And then I reinforce this, whoops, and then I reinforce this. And that's fine, but now it's not equivalence. It's reinforced responding. What I then do is I go back up here and I work on dog. And I get a dog picture and I do dog this way. And I start to see if it pops with dog yet. And I keep doing this reinforcement of the other relations until I no longer have to reinforce those relations. They just start to pop out from training processes. The key is the free learning. We are getting stuff that we didn't reinforce. This is generative. This is thinking. Okay. This is inferential reasoning in natural language. Okay. And we can represent it looking like this. An equivalence network would be this goes with this. So the word cat goes with the picture of a cat. The picture of a cat goes with the word meow, or the sound, but in this case, I've made that all visual. So it's a written word meow, which means you should be able to match this without me telling you to. And we do this all the time. You see it in kids pretend play. You see it in the way children are talked to by their parents. This is relentlessly happening through interaction all the time. You just don't think of it that way. What we don't do enough is think of how important it is that we make sure we train children to do this and then test that they're doing it. Because if they're not, if they're utterly reliant on our reinforcement to do it, then they're not getting the benefits of essentially two trained relations, creating four new learned outcomes. And I want to say that again. Two trained relations leads to four new outcomes. That's generative. That's exciting. Okay. Oh, sorry. And to highlight this, you could actually teach the word verbally too. I could say cat goes with that if you've learned to read it aloud, but I'm going to get to that a bit later. Now, why didn't stimulus equivalence take off? Well, first of all, it arguably did, but it didn't really boom, but not in early intervention in many ways that it could have. And partly because they got stuck on matching, in my view, and partly because I got stuck on everything just goes with everything. So everything's about A goes with B, B goes with C. Not all the other aspects of logical inferential experience, of symbolic experience. They just did goes with. Now, the thing is, humans do more than goes with. We do bigger than. Okay, so if I said A as an example, we say if A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, you can answer the question of which is smallest. If you know. That's not what goes with. That is relationships. And we could talk about embodied cognition if anybody's into that, because there's a clear embodied aspect to this that's quite apparent in early intervention programs now. If VEC is under CUG and CUG is under LARC, what is at top? You can do that. You don't even need to know what a VEC or a CUG is. If A is a ZILC, if B is the same as A and C is not the same as B, is C a ZILC? You can answer that. You have to read it for a while. You can answer that. If you were me, would you be looking at an audience or a stage right now? You'd be looking at a screen. Would you be looking at a screen? If yesterday was today, what would you be doing now? If rain caused floods and there is no flood, has there been rain? You can do all of these, but these are not goes with. These are other types of relationships. And they're sensed relationships. They're physical experiences of relationships that are not matched. They have other forms. They have other relations than just goes with. This is what RFT said, look beyond matching, look beyond goes with. And this is what, if we were looking at this in natural language, We would call this logic. So from an RFT perspective, RFT says we're leaving equivalence, and we're going to the other ways of reasoning, other ways of relating stimuli and then letting that become symbolic. And it gives us a formula for that. It tells us it happens through lots of examples where an abstraction process occurs. I'm going to say this quickly because I'm going to show you in a sec. Okay, so the key part of this is RFT allowed us to talk about self. It allowed us to talk about metaphor. It allowed us to talk about analogy. And we know analogous reasoning occurs. Well, we know metaphorical reasoning occurs. We arguably live in a metaphorical reality. We know these things happen. You can't do that with a matching drill. You have to do it with other relations, not just is. Okay. So what the RFT proposition is, although I should be very clear, this is the RFT proposition to sort of summarize that really once you start prying into this, you're only limited by your creativity because you can use frames to create frames. And you know, there are many ways that you can think of to create a non-arbitrary context or a multiple exemplar task. So we would think in terms of roughly these stages when we look at what RFT is telling us happens. It's telling us that we actually teach a child to relate to the physical world and see relationships. Okay, and the most easiest one to conceptualize is probably size. And then a cue is paired with that, a symbol, a word or something is labeled to go with that. And then what we do is through lots of examples, we abstract that cue. And that cue, in this case, the word bigger than, okay, which RFT would call a C-real, a relational cue, okay, suddenly can be used symbolically, which is all I did up here. These are just relational cues that you were, through multiple exemplars, taught to use. Under, bottom, bigger, these are all relational cues. You, me, these are relational cues because you and me is determined on perspective. Yesterday, today, these are temporal relations, causal relations, okay? These are relational cues. And once they're abstracted, you can stick them into anything. You can put any stimuli into this network as long as you connect them with these relational cues. And the exciting thing is, because of this human experience and the way we work, and again, I'm not sure if anyone's into embodied cognition, but I highly recommend everybody, it should be. If you look at what can happen then, you can actually have a psychological experience with this. So if I were to say something that probably relates to the self in some way, but if I said to my children, if I said, look, we have a fair here where you go and buy show bags that are remarkably expensive and get chocolate basically. But if I said, look, the purple show bag, which is exactly the same size as the green show bag, but I've said, look, the purple show bag has much more chocolate in it, okay? Much more chocolate, and they're the same price. My children, who may have really liked the green one because the green one had a funky picture, would immediately have a different experience of purple and go, actually, purple's looking pretty good. Suddenly, actually, Dad, I'll take the purple, you know, because now it's been transformed. Now, I didn't shape it. There was no reinforcement. There was no punishment used or any extinction process used. There was no consequence. It was a symbol thrown at them, and that symbol thrown at them altered the way that purple bag looked, and it was experienced to them. But even if you say, you know, when you teach size, and you can teach a size with the body, you get a person to stand next to something, I'm smaller than that. Or who is bigger if you stand next to a brother or a sister or a parent. And then I was to one day say, you know, they're a big, that he's just the bigger person in this moment. He's the bigger, he's taken the higher road. I think the famous Michelle Obama quote, you know, when they go low, we go high. And immediately you can almost get a sensation of being above. And literally you will have some sensations as you imagine it, as you conceptualize it. And if you choose to do something related to it, be it in my girl's case, choosing the purple show bag, or in Michelle Obama's case, choosing the next lot of words based on the sense of I will not drop myself to that level of whatever has been interpreted that way. This is what transformational stimulus functions do. We have literally physiological experiences and also instrumental actions. We have actions on the world, physiological experiences based on what the network does. So my Remy, my youngest daughter, will look at, well, she doesn't now because she's been corrected, but for a while they would look at all the people with dark skin and, hope that somebody feeds them until they turn white. That's a thinking process for her. So she'd see dark skin and feel very sorry. I imagine when she actually, because we met plenty of people with dark skin, back then she never met them. And if she was to go down the road here where we have, many more Aboriginals, African families down the road here, they're fine, they're healthy. If she saw them, she'd experience perhaps some moment of uncertainty and confusion back then, because you go, hold a minute, why aren't they really skinny if they've got dark skin? Because in her head, remember, those two things go together. It's a cause and effect relationship back then. And that is a stimulus function. And again, there's no shaping procedure here. This is all done with symbols. This is all done symbolically. This is all thrown into her mind through observation of stimuli, which led to a reasoning process or a network, and that led to outcomes both physiologically and physically in terms of what she ends up doing. If we were to moment of fear, guys, whenever you transfer slides across to other formats, you have that moment of fear of going, do the animations work anymore? So let's cross our fingers. Okay, if we did a traditional discrimination work here with just normal ABA, I could do just give me big, give me small type receptive drills. I could say, give me a big one, give me the small one. I could do labeling. What is the big one? Tell me the color of the big one if we're going to do it that way. Okay. But essentially, it's a pretty classic, obvious activity. Yeah, the animations are a bit off, guys. But the key thing is to remember when it's relational, we must always show it's relational, right? So we all have learned the hard way that a lot of our kids, if we just did big and small with the orange and the blue, for example, they wouldn't necessarily learn big and small out of that. They just learned blue is also called small. For them to really see a relation, we would have to keep the pairing changed. Because of course, blue just became big. So now we have a relational concept, and relational concepts, remember, can only be interpreted in terms of another stimulus, a relation, okay? We can do that. That's discrimination. You're sensing it now. You're having a physical experience of seeing that and labeling it when I ask you to, or identifying it when I ask you to. And we would do that. With STs, we can do all those sort of things. But I could also start labeling on top. I could say red is bigger than blue, blue is bigger than yellow. I can actually talk this way. I can use STs. The red is the biggest, the yellow is the smallest. Now, I'm not sure in Italian, go the way, if there's ERST code, so I don't know if that's got a Latin base or where the English got it from, but that's pretty safe. In all comparisons, we have ERs and STs as our coding, with everything other than more or less. Now, with that in mind, I'm starting to put symbols on top of the relations that aren't just give me big, give me small. I'm labeling the entire experience you're seeing. Because then I can do this. Once you're correctly answering these questions, give me the big, give me the small, tell me the biggest, tell me the smallest, I can do this. I can now make it physically not true. I can make the orange and the pink exactly the same size. And I can say to you, I want you to pretend, a hot tip if you're working with kids, please say pretend, because this blows their mind otherwise. And you say, pretend, let's just pretend that the pink one is bigger than the orange one. Okay, let's pretend. And at that point, this learning history should sit on top of this experience. And they should follow the symbols that are telling them how to relate to this, rather than the sensory experience, which tells them how to relate to it. Now, this is an important moment. This is the moment you've left the sensory world and gone to the symbolic. Because now I'm going to do this. Lots of examples until you finally do this. When I say which is, if pink is bigger than orange, which is bigger and which is smaller? What about if orange is the big one? What if orange is bigger than pink? Which now is smaller, which is bigger? And if you are deriving, if the network's doing the work, you can answer that question. And this is completely arbitrary. I've just labeled it. I can say anything I want, to the point that I don't even need to have stimuli present. I could actually, we have drills here we call the Jack and Jill drills. Poor old Jack and Jill are constantly having relations. Jack's got a bigger house than Jill. Who's got the smaller house? Jack's got a bigger house than Jill. Jill's got a bigger house than Steve. Who's got the smallest? Who's got the biggest? Actually, now I think of it, Steve's got a way bigger motorbike than Jack, and Jack's got a way bigger motorbike than Jill. Who's got the biggest? Who's got the smallest? Jack and Jill, who would have the bigger one? Who's got the smaller one? Now you can say there could be a lot to recall because that's auditory. So you might put some dolls down to help with the recall. But the key point in this is once it's done, you don't even need visuals. You can eventually get to the point you're just telling stories. And you can see how we've left the sensory world and entered into the symbolic. You can see also how necessarily social this is. This has to be a social symbolic experience. And hopefully some of you are thinking to yourselves, that's not too far off pretend play, right? Hopefully some of you are saying to yourselves, that's what happens when a child, I don't know, picks up a stapler and says, this is a knife, or this is a gun, or choose a laser beam if they're aliens or whatever. They say this is a, and they've just given it a symbolic name, which is it's a gun, which means if I've got the gun and I'm the cowboy, everyone runs. Well, maybe not, depending on the way the rules work. All of those are children literally practicing shared labeling and deriving in a way that they shape each other with. They shape each other not on the responses, on the ways of relating until they all have shared rule following and understanding of those rules, which if you remember when I said right at the top, if we all come from the same culture, using the same logical systems, the same meaning of the word bigger and smaller, we can all agree on whether people answered the question about the tree right. We can all agree whether they did it, even though they may have different answers. They've used the logic correctly. And then we can shape each other. Okay, and if we come back to our early equivalence picture, we can rewrite it easily, putting other things. If red is bigger than blue and blue is bigger than green, you've got bigger, smallest, but you can also just go to red and green. Who's bigger, who's smaller? There's no and if you look at those, the picture I've just put up, that could be Jack, Jill, and Steve. Or it could be Cub, Vec, and Quark. Or it could be A, B, and C. They're all going to work. Everything I just said, you can solve because you know what bigger and smaller means. And all I have to do is plug it into that network. And we're now getting into experiences. For example, I could say, look, snakes, baby snakes in Australia, it's like every snake in Australia pretty much kills you, but the baby snakes kill you really, that they have much bigger bite, a bigger load of venom, so they can't control venom, so because they're babies. So if a baby snake in Australia bites you, you have a much higher likelihood of dying than a big snake, a grown snake, because they have a bigger dosage. Just knowing bigger dosage can make you more scared of baby snakes now. So a little snake scares you more than a big snake, which you never would have thought of. You never would have thought a big snake would be the less scary snake. But in terms of volume of toxins released in the bite, the poison that they release, now that's the baby snakes. They're the ones you got to fear. That's just a bigger, smaller relation. And I use volume of poison. And some of you, if you've got really good imaginations, visualizations, maybe even popped out a few thoughts of that and got some sensory experience in your bodies of being bitten and how gross it is, or how ill it makes you feel. If you know the symptoms that you get, which in some of these snakes, the way they kill you is you basically just paralyze and suffocate because you can't breathe. Your heart just stops working. Pretty awful way to die. Other ways, you just break down and you bleed from everything. Now, just now me putting those ideas in your head, that's just done with symbolic relations. That is the potency of these abilities. Now, at 5:30, it's 2.5 hours. Okay, I think I'm on schedule. So I want to then talk about what these relations look like. Okay, so the most important one, without a shadow of a doubt, is coordination, because you got nothing if you can't coordinate. I can't hold this pen up and say that's a quark. Okay, that's a quark without coordination. But if I said quarks are bigger, or this quark belongs with stationery at my receptionist's office, because it does. It's actually my receptionist stationery. That's in the category of receptionist stationery. It's a category now. But all of it was connected first. So there's a categorical frame there, hierarchical frame, but it was coordinated in. You can't get to any other frame without coordination. Everything's got to be stuck together to get to the other stuff that's going to stick together, and that's coordination. So if we look at coordination, and again, in ABA literature, another way, there's no way to pry apart that I'm aware of, Nanny and Others might be, but I've never seen anyone convincingly show me how to pull it apart. But naming, which is Hornblo's naming theory, is completely parsimonious with coordination. It's just that what they're coordinating, of course, is labels to objects, and I would agree completely with their method and their approach. I would just call it's a coordination. Now, I'm going to come back to coordination because it's that important later on. But what I will highlight at this point is that if you look already, you can see there are so many ways to coordinate. Excuse me, there are so many ways that you can stick a symbol onto a sensory experience or a symbol onto another symbol. For example, a cat is a feline, is a symbol stuck to a symbol. Now that can be done thanks to the gorgeousness of the amount of ways that we can connect things. Okay, and I've got a little representational picture here, which I probably don't need, but in the Australian audiences I do. So coordinated means that we have this level above here, which can consider this your mind, for want of a phrase. It's the non-physical world. So the word star is with the experience of star. Okay, so that's the symbol. Now, if you were reading, by the way, and you could actually have the letters STAR down there, that would be in the physical world. It's not symbolic until it actually gets other properties when you say star. Okay. The next thing that follows coordination has to be distinction, which is not. So something is not something is incredibly important, because if something is something, something has to not be something too. This is one of the most potent things you'll learn as well. And kids learn this a lot. We would refer to as exclusionary learning, but when we use exclusionary learning, we can put a name to that. It's not training. It is learning what things are not. So we can easily, and there's a drill we do here. It's a very popular one because it looks clever, where, forgive me, guys, I don't have any stimuli in front of me, I normally would. But if I held up this whiteboard cleaner and this pen, and I said, right, this is a quark, okay? This is a quark. What's this? And you'd say quark, which is essentially a form of imitation. Now point to the quark, point to it. Okay, so we've got a receptive probe. Okay, could you point to the cug? It's only two options. Point to the cug. And you would derive it's this, because it's not a quark. This is not a quark. This is a quark, therefore this is not a quark, therefore this is the cug. And you've just acquired another name through exclusionary learning using not frames. Does that make sense? By using not, now I can shape that, by the way. I can shape that with lots of reinforcement, but I don't want to. I want to just say, this is a quark. Okay, so this is a quark. This one, could you point to the cug? So which one would be the cug? And you can derive that because this is not that. It's not in terms of the description of their relationship, therefore the coordination of cug has to belong to this. And you can train it as a frame, and then you can plug anything you want into it. And you don't have to do it just the way I did it. You can do it through observation. You can have them watching somebody else go, and I say, go to the grab the kettle, and they go grab the thing next to the kettle. They go, no, that's not the kettle. And then I say to the child, I don't let the person continue. I say to the child, can you find the kettle? And the child goes to the other thing, or even points to it. No, that's the kettle. They know that because I've already said that's not the kettle, the one that was grabbed by the person, the model. So I've now taught them how to use observational learning with a derivation. We're accelerating now. Okay, so we have distinction. So we have coordination, we have distinction. And now we have opposition, because we tend to put things into frame of opposition, which in itself is fascinating because there's cultural conventions to this. Biggest and smallest is about a set. They're really easy. But you know, I don't know what it's like in Italian. But in English, I always thought it was weird that, you know, in itself, it's a complex topic of gender these days, understandably. But, you know, when I was growing up in English anyway, males and females, it was considered the opposite sex. And I remember thinking, well, why is it opposite? You know, why did we put that in a frame of opposition? But I guess arguably, well, back then there's only two, so therefore it's opposite in that conceptual framework. Now that's just that's created by culture. But I'm not sure opposite necessarily has to be. They're just different if we even have those two genders alone. Of course, we're now discussing genders beyond those. Now, with that in mind, it's really important to notice that opposite is another relationship we use for convention. Red is the opposite of blue. Now, I'm not necessarily sure from a physics perspective if that's true, but it is culturally true, at least where I'm from, that for you say red, think of another color or the opposite color. People tend to say blue. White, black, that one's on a spectrum. That red and blue, there's not necessarily any convention that says you have to have red and blue in a frame of opposition, but it's just the way it's done. When I say to people, a mouse is bigger than a mouse is smaller than most people in my culture say elephant, because those things have just historically been paired up as a ridiculous comparison of size. Culture creates these things, and again, we're social symbolic. So now, if we have the sun, that is the sun, which is not a circle, it is a sun, but is also the opposite of moon if we want to think of two things. Okay, opposites. That's my male-female example. Okay, now we come to the one that's easily talked about from an RFT perspective, which is comparisons. We see big and little everywhere. We see rougher and smoother. We see wet and dry, or wetter and drier. We have, oh my gosh, it's more or less is a comparison. Anything that has a dimension, usually with the ERs or STs in English, but these are comparative terms that we use for value, we use it for meaning. You know, this is a bigger deal than that. He has more, she has more power than him. He got a higher score than her or them. These are all, actually that's this preposition, but all of those comparisons start to have sensations and meanings. And we can start, of course, in the physical world. You see it physically. You saw me do the example earlier with big and small. You can do it with rougher and smoother. You can say that activity is really rough. It's a rough activity, meaning it's going to have rough texture. It's going to be bumpy. Or it's, man, you got that smooth. Well, that means it was easy. You slid through it, just like the sensory experience. But now I'm using it symbolically. Welcome to metaphor. Okay. So now we can have bigger than the star. So we can have a sun is bigger than a star. I'm not sure that's right. Actually, it should be bigger than the moon. Okay. Now, spatial becomes the next relation we talk, and it's a really big one, and people underestimate its importance because it helps you with categorizing. Up, down, left, right, in and out, inside, outside. These are all spatial descriptors. So if I am in the house and I go through the door, I am now out the house. If I go through the front door, I'm out of the house. I have an in-out relationship with that experience. I can put water in my cup. Okay, that's where the water goes. However, before it's in my cup, it's out of my cup, but it's in the bottle that I'm about to pour in my cup. This can be described, it can be labeled, but then it can be used metaphorically. Once I abstract it into the in and out. Okay, and as you're about to see with hierarchy, I could say something belongs in the category of, just like this stationery belongs in my receptionist's office, not mine. It's out of her office because this belongs in that category. So here it is not in the right category. We use these spatials metaphorically very quickly, but you heard me slip up earlier actually when I said higher or top of the class. Top of the class is a spatial metaphor of looking down. So if you're at the top, you look down, you have the physical experience of looking down, and you can teach it that way, non-arbitrarily. And then you can abstract it, and it's now got metaphorical properties. It now has the symbolic reality associated with it. And you can see that we use it all the time in our language. Because everybody wants to be top of the class, right? Or some kids tell me that they actually want to be not top of the class because then people expect them to stay top, but they don't want to be at the bottom of the class because then they get the attention of the teacher. So they all aim for the middle of the class because then no one really notices that they can get up to stuff. Still, it's a metaphor of middle. But it's middle that's been coordinated with dimensions of attention from others. Spatial metaphor, coordinated with other realities, transformation of functions about what I'm trying to achieve and how I experience the feeling of that symbolic thought process. So we now have another frame, which is spatial, but we're still into interesting territory because we go to the hierarchy, and hierarchy is massively important for analogy, belongs, categorizing, so on. Now, we love this in our early intervention programs. We do lots of sorting. These are closed, these are transport. You know, that was in the book I was raised on. It's a classic categorizing task. Of course, the child learns no more than the category you've shaped. And you ask yourself, well, maybe what I'm trying to do is teach you how to categorize, not what categories are, but the words for categorizing. And the words for categorizing are like belongs with, is part of. okay, is a member of, or and then there's subtle little words like an or a that are used within the language that imply that it's got a membership of some sort. Now, these are part-whole relations, member relations. These are incredibly powerful because they carry an enormous amount of meaning. Once you know, and I was going to put the drill here, but see if I can. Whoops, sorry guys, I didn't mean to do that. Are you still looking at my slides? Simon, are you still looking at my slides? Yeah, great. That's okay. Yeah, no, it was another one. This will do. This will do. So as an example, everyone, you know, I could do this. I could say, you could match car and bus and motorbike into a bowl that we're going to call transport. And that's fine. It's sorted with a clear container metaphor for in and out. All right, it's in the category. And I could have another category for clothes over here. You got shirts and skirts and shoes that go in there. But I could then say, let's go back to transport. I said we had a bus and a motorbike and a car. I could say a skateboard belongs in the same category as a motorbike. And then the minute I say that, I've never sorted it. I've never modeled it. I never reinforced you for putting a skateboard there into that bowl. But you've seen the others in that bowl. And then I want to say to you, so what category does it belong in? And you'd say transport. I could even do the distinction. Does it belong in clothing? And you should say no. But I could also do another type of car. I could say, do you know a Tesla is a car? So where does a Tesla belong in clothes? And you'd say no. I've coordinated a member to another member, and that member was never, ever placed into the hierarchical frame, but it's now in there through joint membership. We see this in team sports. We see this when kids get together and team up in games. You're on my team, or that's our team. You're my friend. If you're my friend, you're on my team. These are all ways that we hierarchically organize, but of course, this is where semantics exists. This is where concepts, this is where Partington's and Sunderberg's VB map, when it talked about response generalization, I want 2 or 3 words for that thing. And my question is, how did you get those 2 to 3 words? Because if I had to reinforce each one of those 3 words, I'm not impressed. But if you derived them because you know that they're related, it's very easy to talk about this with language. If you were teaching me Italian, I can learn that Italian is another word. So you can teach me the Italian for cup, which I don't know what it is. My head immediately went to its cuppa or something like that. Cuppa, it would have a beautiful lilt, no doubt. But when I hear that, I now look at a cup, which I've got right here on the screen, and I hear that word. But you never held a cup up and said that to me. I heard the word cup in English. You gave me, Simon, what is cup in Italian? Wow, I had to ask, didn't I? Bicchiere. Bicchiere. Okay, so it probably sounds awful to everybody listening to me, but bicchiere is now I'm looking at my cup down here. When I was talking to Simon, I was not looking at my cup. I just know the word cup and the word bicchiere, which is already phonetically being readapted into my English tongue. Okay, now at that point in time, I now look at this cup, and if he said, Darin, find the bicchiere, it's already gone to an L, isn't it? It's not, isn't it? So, and this pops into my head, or immediately my hand goes and grabs it. But he never pointed to it and said, that's what it is. He put the English word cup with the Italian word cup, bicchiere. It's and by the way, you're learning about phonology right now. My brain is already turning this back into English pronunciation. So I've already murdered it. I apologize, Simon. Thank you for your efforts. Now, at that point, they are attached, but he didn't name it. He didn't point at the cup and say it. He just told me that word is that word. Now I know this in Italian. Well, in a horrible English version of what he said. Okay. Now that's the beauty of relational networking. And that's how I want to see people get things. I want the kids to get their different responses, not through being taught through reinforcement, but being through transformation, through networks, through relations. So when I see a hierarchy, I see nothing but possibilities. I can go, we have a drill sheet here. It's the most ugly drill sheet. It goes for 3 pages and it's like reading physics. But when you look at it, it's literally saying you're going to have a category A and a category B, and you've got A1 and A1, A2 and A3 go in A. B1, B2 and B3 go in B. And then I'm going to coordinate A1 with AZ or let's say A4. And you immediately know the relationship. You would know that A4 and A1 go together, therefore A4 belongs in that category, but it also means A4, A2, and A3 go together based on that category. But you also know that A4 has no relationship to B1 other than not. Because if A is not B, then A1, A2, and A3 belong with A. They do not belong with B. Therefore, they are not B. If A4 belongs in the same category as A1, you now know all those other relationships. That's what I'm hunting. And we can keep doing that because we can train it by rote. We can shape networking, shape derivation skills, which is not the act of deriving until suddenly you're not deriving through reinforcement. It's popping now. It just starts to come out. You derive, which is no difference to how Sidman did his equivalence work. So now we can do things like hierarchical, that the sun is part of the sky. That's been organized up there. So you see the network getting richer and richer and richer. And now we have the gorgeousness of the deictic, which I'm pretty sure I got there. Now, deictic is, and anybody that's worked in early intervention and ABA knows that the minute you see a pronoun, you just feel kind of sick. Now, I and you are remarkable because their non-arbitrary reality is all about me looking at you. When I look at you and speak, it's an I. So from my perspective, I'm an I. And you're a you, but I have to learn that from your perspective, I'm a you and you're an I. And notice how hard this is to say without gestures, because it's awful. It's just awful. The word I gets moved around. We just borrow it. Okay, now, this is where the self-concept starts to form, and we get all sorts of places to put the self. And today is not the talk on self. If Nanny wants all the slides on self, we have all those. Self comes in all these realities. There's I in time, there's I in role, there's I in space, there's I as you. There's all the I's that start to be conditioned, but they start non-arbitrarily. And there's an interesting thing, and I don't know if anyone does programming here, but if you wanted to accelerate somebody's getting I and you use actually space. You use here and there and closer and further. And you actually find that if you do the spatial work first, it's easier for the sensory system to see the non-arbitrary dimensions of I and you. Okay, and then you abstract them, and we abstract them, and there's many famous RFT studies on the I and you, or the Louise McHugh and Barnes Holmes' heaps. But I've got at the very end of this presentation a study that my wife did actually back in 2006, which she probably should have published. But the protocol was, I think, Louise's or Yvonne's. I'm never quite sure who invented it, but it was simple as saying, if I were you and you were me, and here was there and there was here, where am I sitting and where are you sitting? If yesterday I was at the beach and today I'm at the office, if yesterday was today, where would I have been yesterday? If you are on the couch and I'm on the chair, and the chair is here and the couch is there, what am I on? What are you on? If I'm on the chair and you're on the couch, and I am you and you are me, and the chair is here and the couch is there, what am I sitting on? What are you sitting on? This sounds awful. It sounds hard. Every kid passes it. And once they pass it, they start perspective taking. And we've got drills underneath that to help them learn to see, all the joint attention drills or the sensory discrimination drills, where we move them around a box and they identify what you see that's different. So I could have this box here and they literally walk around it with you. And this is where it hurts because I can see me, but normally I can't, obviously. But I can't see the front of this, you can. So I would say, I can see the back and you can see the front. And then I'd say, what can I see? And you go, you can see the back, I can see the front. That's awkward, but let's do the picture of, let's put an X there. The child would say, I'd say to the child, can I see the X? And he would say, no. Let's say I've got a Y here. You've seen that. You go, you can see the Y. I'd say, right, I see the Y and you see the X. And he'd go, yeah. And I'd say, what do you see? Go, I see the X and you see the Y. And then we would walk around. And he could see if he's right and I could see if he's right. We can have some fun about all that. We keep changing pictures. And then I can say, great, mate, excellent work. What can you see now? And notice I said the word now because I'm differing it from then. And you say, I can see the Y, you can see the X. And you've just started to teach perspective taking in the physical world. It's describing the physical world. And then one day I can say, well, mate, I was at home and you were at the park. Could I see what you saw? Could I know? Could I have when you fell over? Could I have felt or seen you fall? Could I have known you fell? And you're starting to develop theory of mind. And it started here. It started with the old theory of mind drills, the old Salian tasks, and all those things. But you're sticking IU in it. This is the gorgeousness of a deictic. Okay, now you know the sun is part of the sky, it's bigger than the star, it is next to from here. So I could say it is from where I am standing, the sun is next to Saturn or something. I am no cosmologist, I'm not even sure where it stands, but that's from my perspective, it is there. And we can see those beautiful here, there references coming out of there. Now then the beauty of temporal, which is where we start to think in time. Time is a fascinating thing because I'm going to controversially say I'm not sure we have a I'm not convinced you can have non-arbitrary time. I can tell you what the arbitrary, what the symbolic cues are for time, but time has to have, because the past is gone from the sensory moment, so it has to be something created. So I would, yeah, that's a much longer discussion, but nevertheless, it's very trainable, it's very teachable. You get a child to do some things in sequence and you ask them, you describe it temporally to them using before and after, now and then, all these todays, tomorrows, and they're all relational. Remember, today is Wednesday, which means tomorrow is Thursday, but tomorrow it'll be Thursday. So if today was tomorrow, what would today be? It'd be Thursday. So you start playing around with time, and you know you've got time right when kids start worrying. When they start saying they don't want to go to Nana's on the weekend because they know the future happens, they just imagine themselves in it. If I said to you, I want you to tell me, what do you want for dinner tonight? You know, so we do this to teach this to parents so they can understand it. I go, what would you have for dinner? Would you have Italian or Japanese? And they all stop and they think about it and they say, oh, Japanese or Italian, they choose one. And then I say, okay, how did you do it? How did you make your decision? And they all, well, I just thought of either the last time I had it, and I had Italian 3 times in a row, so I like Japanese, or they went, I just imagined having Japanese, and I, gave me some salivation, more or less. I had a Pavlovian moment through my symbols. So I went, I'll have the Japanese. Okay, now that there is imagining I in the future. The temporal world is when you leave the moment. But you start in the moment, you describe as quickly as you can these things. And it must be very clear. Many people want to teach it with visuals, like stories, like cartoon pictures, social stories. That's not teaching before and after. That's teaching left and right, if you're in English. It's teaching some sort of spatial relationship, because that's not time. That's a representation of time, physicalized. The only way that'll teach time is if the child takes the pictures and puts the pictures down representing what he's just done. So he learns that that relates to a sequence of events that are in the past, but had a sequence to them. Then it'll teach the time, but only then. It's a hot tip for everybody doing ABA programs. Okay. So now our representational network looks richer, and it's starting to look like a narrative. The sun is part of the sky, it's bigger than the star, it is next to from here, in the moment, but tomorrow it'll look different, yesterday it will look different again. Okay, then we have conditional reasoning, or cause and effect reasoning, and this is gorgeous, guys. I love the causal effect because it's infinite. It's a beast. And we work off before and after, because cause and effect is before and after generally, but this is where culture is fascinating again. So one of the ways that cause and effect gets conditioned, so you describe a causal event that can be experienced. Again, there's a before and after element to it. And the child learns to talk using these relational cues, and then you can abstract it and use it symbolically. Now, I recall vividly one of my favorite drills was you would get a cup and you just knock it over in front of the child, water's on the ground. And you say, why is the water on the ground? And the child should just go back to the event preceding the flow, the spillage, and say, because you knocked it over. Because, which is the word that says backwards in time, the be causal element, left to right, is you did this. In other words, before it fell, this happened. Therefore, the cause is this. And I remember doing this vividly with the boy Liam. I love Liam. Liam is the one that drives up here and critiques some of my early programs. And Liam, basically, I tipped it over in front of him. His mum was in the kitchen watching when I did this. And I said, Liam, why is the cup on, why is the water spilled? And he said, because Dad hasn't fixed the table yet. I literally had no idea what he was on about. And I looked over at his mum, Fiona, and I went, what the heck is that? And she went, oh my God, he must have eavesdropped, because a couple of weeks earlier, she'd had a go at her husband, Mike. I have no Italian for a go is, challenged him, told him off. I'm not sure what the Italian translation would be, about fixing this leg of the table because it wobbled. So as far as he was concerned, the causal event was whatever Dad got told off for. Now, this gets interesting, because you could argue, as I'm looking at that, now that's not correct in terms of the leg didn't cause it. There was no wobble before, but maybe the wobble did occur and you didn't see it, you could argue. But where does cause and effect stop? And we're back at culture again, you see. You could say the cause of the drink being knocked over was the speech pathologist who first taught me that drill. If she'd never met me and I hadn't listened to her, this wouldn't have happened. You could argue it was my mother meeting my father. If that hadn't occurred, then this drink would be fine today. Where does cause and effect stop? And of course, this is a philosophical question, but it's a cultural norm. And along the way of me studying this, I came across, and I did check this with a couple of speakers over the years, but hopefully I'm right again. And I only know the Vase version for some reason, but in Spanish, if I had asked that question in Spanish and then I'd knocked a vase over and it broke, and I said, why did the vase break? The correct answer in Spanish, apparently, is along the lines of the vase broke itself, meaning it hit the ground, because the last proximal event was actually the physical reality. And that's what the answer to that question is. And I've actually heard that in a YouTube clip recently on language, and somebody else has used that example. But I actually asked some Spanish speakers here, and they all kind of went, yeah, that's pretty much one of the ways we do it. Now, in English, there's not a chance you'd say that. In English, there's just no English. We would take it back most likely to the person, to the agency, to the person who caused it. And in fact, it's quite interesting when you start to explore that. The Spanish answer, if that is correct, and what I've been told is correct, that the Spanish would have gone with the last event of physics. They're right. But then again, so are the English with locating it at the causal event of the human that started the chain of reactions. But then again, so is the one about mum and dad being born. But if you just think about that cause and effect process, you see culture now. Because the way the culture does cause and effect alters the way they allocate blame and responsibility. And you start again to recognize how quickly this is cultural. These symbols are in the culture, they're in the shared mind. And this is what we're trying to get to. We're trying to connect everybody to this hive mind process. Liam's cause and effect wasn't going to help him. Blaming his dad wouldn't help him solve the problem. We would say, Darin, you probably need to talk to the guy that knocked it over. So you go to proximal that you can affect. That's the practical use of this cause and effect analysis. But that's only because it's practically useful. That doesn't mean it's true. It just has some benefit of being shared, understood in our culture, and it is a way for him to solve a problem. That doesn't mean it's true. It's just practical. Now, this is, again, the fascinating aspect. When you start to look through this lens, you see how stereotypes work, value systems, cultural norms. You start to see them all emerge just through this. And this is where you get the funny things. Okay. And we now see this rich network. Now, with this, we start to see the answer to the problem. And the answer to the problem of how do we get this explosive generativity? How do we get this personalized experience? How do we get these funny stories the kids come out with, but also our own stuff? How do we get this individual personal experience through these learning processes? How does this happen? Well, I vividly recall, being in Milan with Nanny. Nanny, I don't remember how many years ago it was now. It's a long time ago, far too long. But I recall the beautiful central station there. We were staying across the road. It was Louise McHugh and myself in a hotel, and we're getting ready to go, and there was an earthquake. And I never quite forgot that, you know, in Milan, the first thing I learned is, my God, clothes are expensive in Milan, because we went shopping, and I just will never quite forget that. But the second part is how everybody just looks cool. And the funniest thing for me is, even in Milan, all the Italians in the middle of an earthquake just look cool. Like, nobody seemed upset. So much so that Louise and I wondered if it was actually an earthquake, because you couldn't possibly be looking that cool. But then we just decided Italians always look cool. So in here, now a network takes off with stereotypes and cliches. Nanny's an Italian. He's a member of the Italian category. Italians always look cool because that's how they look, which Darin over here is an Australian. Australian is Darin's a member of that. I'm a member. Italians are not Australians. Now, some pretty ugly derivations are about to happen. Now, Nanny gets to, when I think of Italians, I think of Nanny. When I think of cool guys dressed, walking like that, I actually think of Milan having an earthquake, but that's Italians, being Italians. Which means Nanny must be cool like these guys, walking around in the middle of an earthquake, still having the latest fashion, all right? That's combinatorial entitlement in our RFT terminology. But things get ugly for Darin now. Because Darin is not a member, by definition, of this group. So he doesn't get to have this cool outfit. He doesn't look cool in Milan, okay? And all these derivations lead to this horrible conclusion of Darin is not cool, because Darin's an Australian and Italians get to have the cool. Now, this is a cliche, it's stereotyped, of course, it's very simplistic. But Remy, my daughter, is not intellectually impaired in any way. In fact, she's a bright kid. But at the age of 5, she was pretty convinced that if you were starving, your skin went black. This is not as silly as it looks. And to show you the hilarity of it, because, you know, of these sort of stereotypes, we can get in all kinds of lost stories, don't we? We can think of the only panic attack I ever recall having was when I did a presentation in Europe the first time. And I remember thinking, Australians are well behind us, Europeans in their research, surely, because there was some weird Australian norm I didn't know was in my head, and that suddenly led to all this anxiety. Why would Europeans listen to an Australian? Now you guys are listening to that and going, really? Yeah, seriously. And when I think of Italians, guys, I grew up in a part of Perth, which is pretty much Little Italy, full of orchards. The only Italian I know, and I'm fluent, is how to swear. I can swear fluently in Italian because all my Italian mates taught me how to swear in Italian. I got nothing else. So it's really hard. Every time I think of an Italian word, I think of a swear word. I can't think of anything other than Italian swear words. And with all due respect, guys, all of you are orchardists in my head. These are just in my head. All of you grow fruit and you're really good at it and you swear really well. And you sound better when you swear than we do. Okay. These are networks and they're personalized. Some of you may be laughing at what I'm saying. Some of you are shaking your head. Some of you are going, okay, get on with it. Now, the point is, look at all the derivations that can occur with so little information. There was only a few things that put that together. And look at the derivations that can explode. And it's important, and Nanny one day we'll talk at length about this, I hope, but because of an embodied experience with some of these relations, the way I learned them, member of, belonging with, the security of belonging, which is a categorical term is belonging, but there is also the belonging in a family. So categories can give you a real comfort. Okay, well, I don't belong with the Italians and they look cool in an earthquake. We don't get earthquakes much over here, so I guess it's okay. And now I can take you back to what you did a while ago. I can take you back to this picture. And you can see what I actually did when I asked you this picture is I asked you all the questions that went with each frame. Why is the tree bending? I looked for a cause and effect relationship. What time is it when this is happening? I don't know if that was the first one. What time is it? I don't know about you guys, but I always think that's like morning. Dialectic, what is your view? What picture, what view do you have of it? Where are you standing in relation to it? Do you think you're at the back of it or the front of it? Do you think you're under it, next to it? Do you feel cold looking at it? Hierarchically, I asked you a part relationship. What parts make up this picture? Spatial, the tree is under what? You can see all of these. I just used relational frames, the frames themselves to generate the questions. And I created, using those quite safely, I created knowingly a series of questions that you would be able to answer. And all of those answers we would agree were actually correct. And we would use the word logically correct because they used those relational cues the way that we've all been conditioned to use them. And then once they popped out of you, you may have heard other people's answers, compared those and all those things. You can personalize and go, wow, that's what I thought. I didn't think I'd think of that. I'm actually surprised I thought of that as morning. Now I think of it, it looks more like evening, but then again, I don't know. And we have research for these frames and these families of frames. I'm going to go through this quick because this is not that relevant, but for those of you who are quite appropriately research driven, many of these frames do have some basic studies associated with it. You can choose to believe me or not, depends how conservative a crowd you are, but every one of these frames I use here every day in programming. There's not one of these frames, and it's not even a challenge. Once a kid can coordinate, you're off to the races. The hardest thing is the coordination, because as you're going to see, it relies on so many attachment processes. But these are there, they're yours to work with, and once you've got them, it's just how creative can you be. And of course, once you've got those, you've got all the psychological properties that come with it. Okay, so I can tell you stuff like, for example, that, you know, if you're in Australia, guys, and you see some long grass like that, yeah, watch out for snakes. This is an Africa story for lions, because that's what I was told. But I can tell you in here, if you're in Australia and there's long grass and it's around January through to, let's say, April, yeah, make a lot of noise. And if the grass moves quickly, stop and do not move, because there's snakes in there. Now, some of them will bite, some of them are poisonous, some of them not. They don't want to kill you, but they will if they have to. And remember, if it wasn't a lion, it was a snake in this story, and it is in my story. If there's long grass in that time of the year and you're in Australia, there's a snake in there, and you know that snakes can cause death, which now you know that long grass at that time in Australia creates the sensations associated with death. And death is associated with the end of experience and all the dread that comes with it. So I've just made long grass in Australia during those months scary to you. I told you the truth, by the way, guys. I didn't make that one up. If you do come over here, watch out for the long grass at that time of the year. I'm going to dodge this because it's in your slides. But again, for those of you who like your research, this is a really cool one. I'll go really quick. There's lovely empirical data where you can actually show you how quickly, this is where there's an embodied aspect. I'll do it very quickly. Where, well, this was Dower, I can't see my notes, but I'm pretty sure it was, Louise McHugh corrects me, I say Dower, but I think it's Doer because it's an Irish pronoun, I'm not sure. Let's say Dower. And he basically created relational networks of just abstract pictures and symbols until a person learned what big, small, and large was. People learned this. Instead of there's a number of these, I'm just giving you one subset of the studies he used. But he got stimulus B, which is just a nonsense looking thing, okay? And he gave you a shock to B, and you got a shock response, and that's conditioning, that's just classical conditioning. But then what he did is he just created arbitrary networks. So you can see the training down there, that's the training of ABC, but that weird symbol for A, B, and C, he then put that symbol next to some other just random patterns and things like that. And we're going to call that stimulus A and C, right? So stimulus A, which isn't in any way smaller than stimulus B, it's just been made out to be that based on that cue. And B and the stimulus, where am I? That stimulus A, B, and C, forgive me guys, are given relational cues of size. I'm not doing this very well. Let me do this again in English. He basically did this. He said that I'm going to create a network using arbitrary cues that are just about patterns where A is smaller than B and B is smaller than C, but he gave you a shock to B. And then what he did, half the group were taught that A has that relationship to B and B has that relationship to C, and half the group were not. So that is relationally trained versus not relationally trained. And then you got to remember, they were all given the shock for B. But then he presents A and he presents C and he has a look at what their bodies do. And what you can see straight away is those with relational networks get responses that is equivalent to as if it really happened. So if you look at this, A is smaller than B, right? So it's made out to be a half-strength shot. So forget that, guys, that's got to go in this type. But that A should give them a lower galvanic skin response. They should have a lower experience through anticipation when it comes up, and they do. But when they're shown C, they should experience essentially panic, and they do. But he never paired shock with these. He never paired shock with these. He paired shock with this. But this was put in a network of comparisons of bigger and smaller, or more and less, with these stimuli, which created this unconscious response in the body. In other words, he had a response as if it actually occurred to them, even though it hadn't. There's no conditioning that's occurred. This can only be explained by him having established a symbolic network between A, B, and C, which is cool. And it's been done with all sorts of things: sexual arousal, response rate, oppressing lipids. Okay. Oh, there it is. Let's do a Hamilton effect. Now we do a drill like this in clinic. We can do this like this. There's your 3 cars. There's a black one, a red one, and a green one. I just arbitrarily give them meaning. They're all exactly the same size to the child. I want you to pretend that the blue is bigger than the red, and the red is bigger than the black. Now park them. Where would they go? You tell me. Point to the one where red would go. Point to the one where blue will go. I could change that again. I would say, well, actually, let's pretend that blue is bigger than red, and red is bigger than black, and park them again. I could eventually get really sophisticated where I could make all those garages the same size and give them their own little labels, A, B, and C, or Jack, John, and Steve's house. We do a lot of Jack, Jill, and Steve here for some reason. And I say, right, Jack's house is bigger than Jill's house, and Jill's house is bigger than Steve's house. Got it? Yeah, got it. Jack, Jill, and Steve, you got it. You maybe put it in your head by self-talk. And then what you do is I tell you where blue, green, and blue, red, and black are in their own networks, and I say, now park them. I could do another one where I put bridges, believe it or not. We put little bridges here. And I say, that's a wood bridge and that's a steel bridge. And we actually usually just use 2, and this one is just a normal road. And I say, right, this car is heavier than this car is heavier than this car. Wood things break under heavy load. So if it's heavy, wood things will break when it's heavy. Where would you like to park the heavy car? And you should choose either across the steel bridge or across the normal road, but you should not go across the wood bridge. I should even be able to say, if the heavy car goes across the wood bridge, or if I even did this, and I said, you know, big cars are heavier than small cars, and the black car is bigger than the red car, and the red car is bigger than the blue car. Now you know their relations. You also know their weights because of the rule I just gave you. Now, which one wouldn't you put over the wood bridge? And you should say, I'm not going to put the black car over the wood bridge. Can't go that way, it'll break. And we see this happen all the time when kids pretend play. They are constantly inventing these realities and they're behaving according to. And this is trainable. You train this, you test this, and then you put novel stimuli and you go again. And eventually you can end up with quite a complex long map of roads and paths until eventually it looks like play. But you're just constantly throwing relations and seeing if the child correctly derives. And if he doesn't, well, you know you have some shaping to do off that relational cue. And you might pull it out, you might do it academically or more tabletop-y or more artificially, and you plug it back in, and away you go again. And of course, that's transformation of functions up there, but here's an explicit version. The red box has more tokens than the blue box, but the yellow box has more than the red box. Which box do you want? If the yellow one is taken, which one do you want? And this is just problem solving using relations based on desire or derive. By the way, tokens, you can have red tokens and green tokens. The red tokens are bad tokens. You don't want the red tokens, you want the green tokens. So I'm going to say the blue box has more red tokens than the yellow box. The red box has less than the yellow box. Which box do you want? Well, take the one with the least, which is, in this case, the red box has the least amount of red tokens. And again, the beauty of this is you've just taught problem solving. You've just taught also, if you think about guys, a coping skill. Sometimes all the options suck. Choose the one that sucks least. And it's all through relational networks. It's explained and it came through early development of all the other skills. Now, I didn't do this at the start because funnily enough, it's not as important as it used to be in my mind, but we describe the relations, and you saw me do it briefly with the nanny as an Italian, therefore he's cool when he walks through earthquakes in Milan. You heard me talk about briefly combinatorial entailment and mutual entailment. Essentially, this is just describing the complexity of the relationships of the derivations. If and you know what, because forgive me guys, it's late here, and I've just had a mental blank, it is reflexivity. reflexively, yeah, I think it is. I can't remember the stimulus equivalence terms anymore. But mutual entitlement, if A goes to B, B comes back to A. If B goes to C, then C goes back to B. This is mutual entitlement. One implies the other in reverse. Combinatorial is when I take both those relations and get a third. So if A goes to B, B goes to C, then I know that A is related to C, which is equivalence. Now, transformation of functions, you've just seen how many ways we can do that. In RFT, we would say C real and C func, and we don't talk about stimulus control transfer, we talk about transformation. Now, again, I'm going to toy with transformation here. There is a massive amount to talk about transformation because there's a couple of slides later on where I'll show you how important it is to think in terms of bang for your buck, in terms of transformation. You want to teach a skill that doesn't just explode through the networks, it explodes through the potential repertoires. You want to make sure the child has those, and if you do those well, they become self-organizing systems that the child learns to teach themselves. And I'll get to that. Now, we have plenty of indirect support that everything I just told you works developmentally. Hart and Risley, I've shown you above, but there's correlational research, there's theoretical research. Again, I'm not going to spend much time except to point you towards some of these studies. We know that we've used relational frame theory and then relational networking. The relational networks are same and opposite more or less, and seen cognitive benefits. It needs an enormous amount to unpack this. There's still, of course, not saying there's not neurological limitations on some element of IQ, but there is no doubt that when they did these interventions, just a relentless training of getting people to use same and opposite more or less, these young kids, you can see them here, they got significant jumps in cognitive ability. Significant, which fits what Hart and Risley saw. Do you remember what all the language development research tells us? What we see in cognitive development, everything gets that weird curve. It's not like that. It's an exponential curve. It's a spoon shape. And what I'm interested in is why this shape exists. And this is important because stimulus equivalence wasn't enough to get the big bump. It was all the other relations that really took you off, right? I'm not saying stimulus equivalence doesn't help, but it really booms when you got all the other relations. Now, the key is we know that we have this generative exponential development. We are obliged to understand why. I want to know that you exploded and I lost control of you. I want to not know that you learned that from me. I want to literally listen to the response you came out with and go, how did you get that? That means I've got the spoon. I got that exponential. Things are bubbling. Things are taking off. That's attached, this mind, to all the symbolic realities that are out there, or realities that are out there. And this is the kink. And it seems to be explained by symbolic processes and derivations, which RFT does a really good job of scaffolding for us, of slicing up for us and giving us our targets and our methods. And of course, there's the summary of the overall effect. And we've got other frames that follow this, hierarchical frames follow this development, okay? We've got it in early childhood for didactic frames. You can see it changing over time using that didactic protocol. Okay, and we know that there are cusps analysis that indicate that is true. We can see bang for buck where we target certain relational things. We do see developmental changes such as we saw with the Cassidy and Rose study, but also we can see it in TAPA and RCP and other things that are coming out. And again, I'm just giving you references. I'm going really quickly. The translators probably hate me right now. I don't want you to spend time on this slide. I want you to go look up the literature. What I want you to get out of this is that we can explain this and argue this quite elegantly. This is the missing link of the explosiveness of human development. And Tomasolo, normally I do a show of hands. Does anyone know Tomasolo? Everyone knows Chomsky, but doesn't anyone know Tomasolo? I wish more people knew Tomasolo than Chomsky. He basically studies language acquisition and symbolic process and cognition and development. And I own every one of his books, and I urge everybody to own every one of his books and read them if you're interested in human development and functioning. But he clearly showed that learning comes from the concrete world and then gets abstracted. He clearly showed that the grammatical structures and the things that that Chomsky would say is innate is not. It's come from concrete experience, which is why you can go to Kuhnian work and all the metaphorical reasoning activities, metaphorical research. everything we use is a symbolic abstraction of the physicalized existence. Even when I say that's not the point, when we're having a conversation, I used a metaphor of this beautiful thing that is our index finger. When I say, no, you're not understanding my point, I meant metaphorically, I'm trying to point at some aspect, some topic in my narrative, which is the equivalent of, that's a bottle. That's the point. We never stop abstracting our physicalized, and then we just live up there. And Tomasolo showed it. You know, just to be very clear, Tomasolo is no fan of behaviorism, but I'm a fan of Tomasolo. And this is a beautiful example. He's got heaps. Okay, we also know that joint attention greatly facilitates language. So we know that the social aspect is important, and we know that the social aspect is necessary for the exemplars to work. We know that we have to pass this to each other, just like RFT predicts. We also know it can be done without joint attention because, of course, we have children with, well, we don't say Asperger's anymore, but we see them without joint attention, and they do get language. So we know it's largely an imitation skill that's abstracted and gone on fire. However, whenever we talk to someone with Asperger's, their dialectics are really terrible, and their perspective-taking language, their awareness of subjectivity, their formality of their language compensates for the lack of their ability to orient people's senses. So we can still see evidence of how it affects them. But the clear part is, again, this is consistent with what RFT says about language. It should develop this way. Because it says, and this is not from RFT, this picture is classic naming theory, it's classic, this is where species use this picture for how language develops, you know, at least over here. And have a look at it. It is a mum looking over at the, whatever that thing is, a glim apparently. The child looks back at the mother points at it. The child looks back at where the mum points, and at the site of, at the point he sees it, she says glim. Now, with his imitation and his joint attention, and he's in a echoic capacity, hopefully he's got an articulatory capacity to imitate what he's heard, because of course we know echoics has got auditory matching and imitation in it. When that occurs, he says glim, and she says, yeah, that's a glim, well done you. Now, she's reinforced the act of learning names. She didn't reinforce glim. If we look at it simplistically, we go, he's learned glim. What we want to do, no, is how quickly did he learn words like glim? Did he learn the act of naming? I really don't care how many words a person knows. I care about how quickly they can acquire them, but also the range of ways they can acquire them. Again, this is different to looking at, do you know names? It's how many ways can you learn a name? Oh, and you can see joint attention, of course, in there. Okay. Sorry, I'm just going to skip through somehow. Now, if I put that into application form, and I am half an hour behind schedule, this is all there for you. See if I can do this naturally. It changes the way the program. Now, this is such a long conversation to have. I'm going to just personalize it to us. That the program looks so different now. We have a thing called the exploding triple triangle, which is not in here for you, but I can send those to Nanny if you like them. But we don't look at anything like the way we used to in a traditional ABA way. And again, none of this is critical of ABA. I'm not. ABA is the reason I stayed in psychology. I am a massive fan of Skinner and will remain one, and of Sidman and many, many others. However, we look at development differently from that operant point of view now. Now, we still think in terms of ABA. We still think in terms of there is a non-desired response, and we use extinction. We very rarely use anything other than social punishers, like, you know, natural punishment systems that would occur within a social dynamic. We don't use anything we consider coercive authoritarian. Largely, we're using extinction. We're always thinking about what's the natural reinforcer or the natural stimulus that we would like to pair with any of our artificial stimuli to create conditioned reinforcers. We're always thinking that way. But the key is the prompts. You know, it's funny. The prompts are the forgotten key to the story is the prompts. We can use hand over hand, gesture, gaze, point, model, cue. I actually Googled prompts in ABA for this, and I found all these lovely pyramids of triangles. And they're all pretty much the same. You know, the gesturals is within stimulus prompting, of course. You can make it more salient, positional cueing, of course. If you're really clever, you can use the patterns of responses as a prompting system, very subtle. But they're all to orient the child towards something you want them to attend to, or they're to get the response out of the person after they've attended it, which is an explicit response prompt. It's all designed to get the response out of the person so that you can shape it. That's absolutely valid. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's a massive part of human learning. Okay, but when you look at it and you think of it more socially, we start to go, well, even more from an RFT symbolic perspective, we go, it's not just enough to go, I want you to learn imitation and joint attention and cueing. I start to think, I want you to learn stimuli that are going to be highly familiar to your language, because we know that's going to help with symbolics later. I need you to get really fine-grained auditory discrimination skills, because I know that most of our symbols are held in the spoken word. I also want to do a lot more delayed matching drills, because I know, and there is, you know, it would take a lot to convince me otherwise now, that when we engage in a symbolic derivation, particularly non-identity matching, there is some sort of conditioned seeing or self-echoic process going on. There is response time measures that when a person still is learning how an arbitrary relation goes together, you can find anticipatory responses. There is a time delay that indicates there are intermediate responses that are happening covertly. And conditioned seeing seems highly likely, because if you can improve a person's ability to delayed match, you do seem to more quickly get naming skills. So there is, for want of a cognitive term, mental imagery going on, and it is a useful thing to do. So we start to think we've got to get these things in place now too. It's not just enough to go to the old days of hand over hand, of gesture and gaze and point. We've got to get these other skills up and running so that you can learn well and learn symbolically. And we also know that the whole thing's social. So I need your joint attention to be a skill that's really pivotal. And the reason I need that to be pivotal is because we forget that me looking over here at these guidance cues, hopefully one is a social experience where I look to you for guidance on how to do that. Hopefully I look for guidance, not for you to do it, because of course we know that's prompt dependence. Now we know that imitation is a massive social transmitter. We saw that in the very first slide I showed you, where that's how we beat the monkeys. Okay. We know that self-echoic helps naming. We want kids to talk to themselves, and we have drills like that. We have drills where we give them a bit of information to go past to their parent. And we want them to learn to just hold the verbal, not the visual, the verbal, okay? Because we know that that self-echoic is a bit like the conditioned seeing or the imagery. It's going to help when you start doing non-identity matching, which is what symbolic relations start to become, because they're non-identity. They're not connected by any stimulus dimension. They're associated. Gesture becomes massively important for didactics, but you know, give you a tip, guys. If you want to help teach mathematics, get a kid to start to also put 1 is there, so 2 is there, then 3 would be there, and see if they can put their hands where they would imagine that would go. And you've started to get another aspect of the sensuous experience that we might call imagery, because the gestures help the system go through that recall procedure, that embodied element that we would call transformation to function. Okay, and another one that we don't talk enough about, which is pattern discrimination, because you want the brain filling in. All the illusions are fill-ins, and the more fill-ins you are, you'll start to see pattern fill-in. And what is, the English is Mary had a little, and every English person hears the word lamb. If I said ABC, every English person hears D. Okay, those are patterns that are filled in by the brain. You want that, because arguably when you're teaching your first frames, you're teaching patterning skills. And those patternings become fill-ins, and those fill-ins become automatic till eventually it becomes a self-echoic to talk to self, and away you go. Now, when you look at everything I just said, all of those prompts can be reframed as an attachment. They can be framed as the way children get information from a parent. We can say a child gets some sort of confusion, they look up at a parent, the parent gives them guidance, the child uses what they got guidance on, it works. Now, we know this is how attachment works. We know this is how social transmission works. These are prompts. These are what we call prompts. They're also skills, but we use those skills to create other skills. These are prompts. And if it was meaningful to the learner, they take what was prompted and they transfer it across, or they transform it across in the way they go. They have independence. Now, to show you how potent it is to think this way, and I really want to drive this home today if I can in early intervention. Giving information to somebody can be a potent reinforcer because it empowers them. Okay, not comply, be empowered. If we think of our prompts, we start to realize there's a relationship between the learner and the prompter. Now, I want to show you a hot study very quickly on children on the spectrum, where he looked at joint attention. And basically, the drill, we run this drill here, we call it a cup game, we don't use lollies. But he put some jelly beans down from my memory. And basically what he did is he had the therapist look, but the animation's gone now, but would look, there it is, at one answer, and the child grabs the one that is looked at. That's all that happens. That's the drill. Just looks over at what you want the child to grab. Okay. Now, this is where it's really impressive. When he had the toys out, which is what he's calling intrinsic, just playing with something to say, social feedback and sweets available, he looked at what the kids did, and they did this before the drill. After the drill, where mastery had occurred, this is how it changed the children. They started social feedback, became attractive, it became something they sought over and above sweets. Now, why did they play more? Because their parents almost certainly played with those toys. So just by doing this and saying, I'm useful to you as a learner, the child started to seek that person out as an information source. And when that happened, sweets, biology wasn't so attractive because you're not just an attachment figure, you're an information source, which is why not only do I want social feedback, I started to get skills. And what this does is it just changes how we think of what I would argue is the most important part of our interventions, the prompt, the way we transfer information to each other. And when we think of it from an RFT perspective, we realize that there are two types of ways. There's non-symbolic prompts, like what we largely do in ABA, I would argue is mainly non-symbolic prompting. We use positional cues, modeling, feedback, feedback's the shaping procedure, but we use in the moment, antecedents, presence, guidance. I'm not saying we don't try instructions and rule govern, we do that, but we mainly are doing me showing you how to do it at the time, or if we're a Greer and we're doing all the great observational learning drills he does, you're watching somebody else, and he would call that a yoking or something similar, but you're in the antecedent, you're in the moment. Now, that normally means this is what's going to happen, that stimulus control transfer that prompt creates usually requires another personal stimulus present at the time, obviously. It can only generalize to similar antecedents. Of course, this is the phenomenon of generalization. It has to have the stimulus overlap. Similar stimulus properties have to exist as you go across generalization. Obviously, there's going to be usually a shaping procedure of some sort to acquire and generalize. Exception, of course, being imitation, but even then you may need to shape. Now, the key thing is you need to keep reinforcing the generalization before it takes off, where those stimulus dimensions become selected out, okay? And you're largely, the learner is connected to the physical world alone. Wherever they learned it, or whatever the stimuli were, that's where it stayed. Okay, so if I taught a light switch here, I might generalize it to light switches around the place. I might change some colors, so you learn that you've got light switch. But what happens if I didn't teach light switch through non-symbolic prompting? I did it through symbolic prompting. What happens if I actually have taught kid categorization and I've taught him on and off? A switch turns things on and off. This turns the light on and off. Switches turn things on and off. It's in the category of on and off. Okay. So that's called a light switch. It belongs in the category of on and off, turning things on and off. All right. He can explode now. If he's got hierarchical framing, he can explode to anything that's on and off, and he can immediately think of his train set and wish he had a switch for it because he has no way to turn it off. Or he maybe does have an on and off switch, and he goes train switch. He might derive that and call it a train switch, or just go, it's got a switch. I never taught him that. There was no model. There was no hand over hand. There was no shaping procedure. That was derived, and it was explosive because he got it in a different way to the conventional way. I didn't now go to light switch and point that. I didn't do any sorting. I didn't take the train switch and the other ones and pair them into we talked about hierarchical networks earlier. He knows how to do hierarchy because I taught him how to do hierarchy. So now when I used a hierarchical explanation as a prompt, because it is a prompt, when I am saying to you, this is what that is, I've transferred meaning to it. So it is functioning as a prompt. Now you know it. You don't have to ask me again. Now you've got the light switch, but you've now got switch concepts all over the place. So you can generalize through your personal network if you're into trains, okay? You can generalize into jokes and humor, sometimes I wish I could switch mum off, It doesn't require explicit reinforcement or shaping. And a person can consciously self-prompt because eventually they can talk about on and off, okay? They can think of their own symbols of on and off. They can draw on and off switches, okay? And more importantly, because I've used the symbols of our culture, they can watch the news and get a joke, get the concept of, you know, a headline that says, you know, I don't know, such and such has been switched off early, or, you know, we're going to, such and such, the television stations cut him off or switched him off early. And suddenly that symbol has meaning because our symbolic culture wraps around with these categories. Every time you read a headline, it's just relying on them. So that means we come back to our model and we start to see, yeah, we got the target and stuff, but now look at what's exploded. Now you have explanations and books and media and discussion and eventually self-talk. And you don't have to have the antecedent present at all. In fact, you don't need any of the antecedent behavior consequence present at all. But it can all be learned and acquired and put into practice. That doesn't mean shaping doesn't occur. That doesn't mean the person doesn't take it and use it. The person could misapply the word switch like Remy did with skinniness and skin color. And that will be shaped through social feedback or function. The kid could use this, this must be a switch because it goes on and off, like the cat goes on and off on my bottle. He could say switch. And I go, that's an interesting derivation because it does go on and off. It's a different on and off. We're going to have to talk about circuits or something. Okay. And that will be fed back. Or when he says, Darin, can you switch off the bottle? I'll be confused. So literally there'll be a shaping experience because it will fail him. Now, we start to think of prompts as social transmitters. And when we do that, we start to see the transformation of function possibilities. We start to say, I don't want to teach you circle. I want to teach you ways to learn circle. So I want to maybe gesture with my eyes or my point or my holding like this. I want to be able to do that. So you eventually, and this is classic naming, I will point to it, you will say that, you will copy me first, and that will be, if I've said that's a circle, you'll say that's a circle and imitate, and I'll say find the circle, so then you'll point. And we have a naming frame where you're receptively and expressively acquiring the concept of circle. Now, that's fine, classic naming, okay? But I could then do circle as a shape. So now it's words about words, so I'm naming a symbol about a symbol. And of course, the child has got a physical history of the experience of circles, so he can have a sensuous experience of it. So he could arguably be visualizing the circle he saw, just like, and you know, it's already gone, the Italian is already gone for cup, because I'm back at cup, sorry guys. But the reality is, bicchiere, oh, that's hard, bicchiere. So now I'm at biscuit. So I've got Bicky, which is the Aussie for biscuit. Bicchiere. Bicchiere. Tazza I can work with. My tongue's being tortured and I feel like I'm offending all of Italy trying to speak Italian. So tazza. Okay. So I can say tazza. You can say right now, in fact, I just got that. Tazza is tea, isn't it? Is that right, Cecilia? Oh, it's also a cup of tea. Okay. No. I'm gonna. Oh, you're right. I'm. Geez, you guys made it hard. You've got different words for cups based on what's in it. Geez, really? So depending what fluid is in the cup, you call it a different thing. That is complex. So tazza is a cup of tea. Okay. So that's okay. My ego wants to get bacchieri, but it's already gone. So tazza. Okay. So tazza is Italian for cup of tea. Now it's great because this is just a cup. So I'm actually imagining like a cup of tea, right? I'm imagining that it's up there. I got the conditioned seeing, it's visualized and all that sort of stuff. You can ask me, Cecilia could ask me questions about tazza now and I can answer. She could, Darin, what describe the tazza? Or what is a tazza? And I can say it's a cup. And I can say, well, technically, I know it's a cup of tea. It's not a cup of water, right? It's a cup of tea. I know that, right? Because of the relational network that I can exist with and do that. But I can also do this. And so can a child. I can answer questions. She can say, well, Darin, what is a tazza? And I'll say cup of tea. But I can go back the other way, whoops, and say, Darin, what is a cup of tea in Italian? And I'll go, it's a tazza. Okay. So I can now swing it both ways because I know that those things are coordinated. In coordination, if A is B, then B is A. I know that straight away. But she can even do this to me. She can say, Darin, what is this? And she could point, she could hold up a cup of tea And she said, what is this in Italian? And I go, that's a tazza. I can point at it. She never showed me a cup of tea before. When she trained me, she did not show me that. Now she's going to show me the cup of tea. I go, what's this? I go, it's a cup of tea. It's a tazza. In Italian, it's tazza. So I can now do that. I can identify in Italy. In fact, if I go to Italy, I can literally go, that's a tazza. Okay. By the way, okay, then I'm going to be in trouble. It's going to take a while. I could just go back to swearing, but that's okay. But this is then the next part. You could actually say, oh, these pictures of cups doing things. I could have a coffee, just a tazza is just the container, right? So it's not tea. So, but either way, I'm running out of trouble. I'm getting into trouble here. But she could put a variety of things out and point to the tazza, and I can identify it. But she could also do this. She could say, could you draw a tazza? And I could get it out of my body into an image. She could say, could you describe what you see when I say tazza? Which means I've got a visualization that is available to me. Can you model as if you had a tazza? And you see the explosiveness that has put all those functions now come out of just learning tazza. So not only do I have a relational network that connects tazza to a cup, container of tea in my head, I've got all these ways of expressing that concept. I can gesture it, I can draw it, I can identify it, I can label it, which means I can put it into other functions like requesting and directing and so on. All of that is explosive. And so we don't ever want to teach these things and leave them separate. We want to go, if you've got tazza, you get cup, you need to be able to, can you draw it? Can you make it out of Play-Doh? Can you point at it? Can you label it? Can you then, of course, the other functions of automatic, can you request it and comment on it, which are different reinforcers? Can you do those things? Because if I can get that, I get all the instrumental benefits too. I get all the other evocative capacities that a concept has for you rather than just the one I taught you. And again, we're getting generative now, but this is a social process. This can happen so easily just through social interaction. And if not, we can drill it down to teaching each one individually. And because we know how the coordination or equivalence in this case works, we know the way to condition that response cluster together. So I throw a concept at it and the cluster explodes. The cluster of responses, it just explodes from that stimulus, from that symbol. So when we think, how does this change us? Not only does the prompt make us, we stop thinking of prompting, we start thinking of social transmission. We open our eyes to all the ways we can transmit. And we want to measure for that, and we want to target for that. So no longer do you have a goal like, I want to teach colors. You just don't say, I want to teach colors. You don't want to say, I want to teach you red. You want to, I want to teach you red by this, by imitation, by naming, naming with a gesture, naming with eyes, naming through observation, naming through through fast mapping or exclusionary learning. I'm going to tell you the way I want you to learn the label, because I'm not interested in you learning the label. I'm interested in the ways that I can show you a label. I'm interested in the ways that you can learn a label from me. And then on the other side, I want to explode it through. Now you got the label. Can you tell me what it is? Can you identify it? So can you label it and use it for communication? Can you identify it receptively? Can you draw it? Can you gesture it? Okay, all the things that come out of your body that are capable. So it goes in and explodes out. And I've got so many ways to put these into you. And you've got so many ways that come out of you. I've just made you a generative human being. And it's so personal because it's going to hit your network of history and just boom. Okay. So we think, and I've got an example here of a way, by the way, this is just one way. This is one way we've used, and you're limited only by your creativity. You can start to think this way. So you go, I'm going to have, sometimes we call this the show trial. I'm going to present the information to you. Then I'm going to see if you can just copy what I did. Can you just literally take what I did and use it? And then I'm going to distract you or something like that. And I'm going to give you this again. I'm going to give you that trial again. If you get it correct, so let's say I'm going to say, I want you to learn Jack and Jill. I'm going to say, we're just going to use naming for now. This is Jack. This is Jack. Okay. So then I'm going to say, so who is this? And you're going to say, that's Jack. So you just imitated me. It's just an imitation. Or if not, I'll prompt you to imitate me, Jack. Then I'm going to give you one you know. Like, it's already gone. Tapa, tatsa. Anyway, it's the way the phonetics works. But I'm going to give you one that I know you know. And I'm going to say, what's this again? Okay. And then you're going to tell me. And if you get it correct, If you get it correct, I'm going to then give you another one that you didn't know, and we're going to do it again. But I'm going to come back now after I've taught you a new one, like say Jack. So that was Jack. I'm going to teach you Jill. And then I'm going to come probe Jack again once you've passed Jill. But now I'm not going to go back and present this. I'm just going to see if it's stuck. I've taught you Jack this way. I want to see if it's stuck. I'm also going to teach Jill. So I'm going to teach, we usually work in sets of 3. I'm going to set you to 3 words and they're going to filter through this process. So I'm going to teach you blue. Then I'm going to teach you red. And I'm going to probe blue. Then I'm going to teach you yellow. And I'm going to probe red. And then I'm just going to keep probing those. And every time you get it wrong, I'm going to go back to presenting it this way until you get 100%. But what really matters to me is not that you got it wrong, not that you've learned red, blue, and yellow. It's the way I got it into you, because eventually I want to see that I can teach you aubergine, green, and I don't know, yellow, gold. Through just the same way I did those, and you never get it wrong. I go, that's aubergine, that's red, that's aubergine, that's gold, and that's whatever my other color was, green. And I can just point and label them because that was what my show trial was. That was the way I presented the information. And I want to see how can you just stick, so that I very rarely find myself on this side. In fact, once you've learned how to learn this way, I can just skip the transfer trial altogether and just probe you, and you've got it all. You are just now circling through. It's just in your head. And what I'm really interested in is, did that work well? And if that worked well, I've taught you another way to learn colors. And I might use eye gaze, pointing, holding. I might is, goes with, same. I could use equal signs, arrows, pictures. These are all goes with. And I want to see all of them being used in my presentation of information and then filter it through to see if it sticks. And if it sticks, I never see you on this side of that flowchart, because that works so well. And there's no reinforcement. After I've taught you that, remember, when you get it right, the first time I do it, I'm going to reinforce you so you learn the network. But after that, no more reinforcement. You've just got them. So yep. You've got all those at the end. I'll reinforce you. So what that means is when we measure, I'm just jump through, guys. See, the graph looks different. I don't want to know, did you learn red, blue, and green? I want to see how quickly. So red, blue, and green there. This is yellow, purple, and orange. And this is, I don't know, whatever colors are left. Silver, gold, and platinum. And now I don't know, whatever's left. And you see what I'm hunting here is how many trials I needed to get you to 100. And this is what our graphs look like when we're doing transfer or transformation. Now, this is just one output. If we had multiple outputs, there'd be 3 or 4 lines here, because it's, can you identify it receptively? Can you say it expressively? Can you gesture? Can you make it in a gesture? Can you can you make a picture of it? We may run all 4 of them. And we want to see how quickly until all 4 just pop out, which means I only had to tell you this through this method that many times, once or twice, and it's through. It's stuck, it's there, and it's popping out through all those channels. And we can now say to the parent, don't anymore say, you know, find the green, you know, find the cup, or where's the cup, and then point to the cup for them. I say, just say, this is a cup. Just go around your kitchen and find everything they've not heard of, and just point and tell them what it is. And then as soon as you can, find an excuse to tell them to go get it. So, you know, teach them what a colander is. I only learned what a colander was about 10 years ago. So point to the colander, say, honey, this is a colander, just so you know for future reference. And then after they've had their orange juice, saying, hey, could you grab me the glass? And while you're at it, get the colander. And just see, did it transfer? Did it go across there? But then test for some other transformations across. Well, that's transformed already. But can you then say to them, hey, buddy, what's the thing with the holes in it? And he should say, colander. Because I told him the visual, which he had the experience of, and it should go the other way. It now is just how creative can you be, because we've taught you so generatively. And the parent can confidently be just existing and passing information along through natural human interaction. So I've given an artificial one, that you could just have a conversation at a table and the child could be just learning now, just listening to you throwing words at each other. So we start to look at mastery differently. We don't look at mastery from, did you get 15 words or 25 words? We're not interested. The VB and others do use that. no doubt. They'll use the bank of words, and that's like an indirect measure. But I'm just not interested in how many words you get. I want to know how many ways you learned it. So I'm measuring response acquisition rate. I want to know how quickly you got it. And then I want to see what I could transform. Did you turn that into a game? Could you go and use it in a request form? Could you draw it? But more importantly, could you use it for your needs? Could I put it into storytelling, pretend play, game play? Could you go along there very quickly and see it in the cultural devices that I know will keep it bubbling along? Because if you do pretend play with your peers will shape more stuff in there that didn't come from me. If you watch YouTube, it'll throw more things into your head that didn't come from me. And that's how it should be, because I want you sticky now. I don't want to say, I taught you this, I taught you that. It's I taught you how to learn, and then I let you go. And then I taught you what to do with learning to empower you, and then I let you use it. And that's the generative aspects. So mastery is a different experience now. It's not what skills did you get, it's what ways to learn did you get. I've got 6 minutes. So if you looked, we've got a number of different ways we write draw sheets, because you start to realize it's just up to your creativity. Utterly measurable. You've got a shaping procedure, you've got prompting plans, all that stuff, no different to ABA. But we would start with a non-arbitrary, the physical world, and then we use a formula. So we abstract you, much like I showed with size. We teach you the normal, what I would call traditional, what I was trained in, not everyone, trained in traditional ABA, maybe size or before and after, or more or less, whatever. You've got that, and the very first thing we do, as soon as you've got it, is we start to abstract it. And when we abstract it, we use a test train criteria, because of course the kids need motivation. So the test train criteria looks like this. Once we're going to see if you can do it, we can't reinforce you, because if we reinforce you, we're just shaping it. So when I say Jack's bigger than Jill, and I say who's bigger or who's smaller, I can only say, good effort. I can't tell you what's right. Okay? I can't do that. So I'm not going to make you do a lot of that, because you're going to go, what am I doing? The poor old child's sitting there waiting for feedback. So if you can get the first 5 of those correct with random rotate, we would consider that passed, and then we start using it in other ways. And we tell you after 5, well done you, because you've just popped them out, they've just arrived. But the minute you make an error, we go back into training. So we reinforce every response. We tell you what you're doing, and we shape like with a normal schedule reinforcement. And we thin our reinforcement accordingly. And then once you've got that set, we go to the next one, give you another set. I'm now going to do, I don't know, elephants in Africa are bigger than the ones in India, and we go again. And when we go again, we want to see if you can get 5 out of 5. And if you can, you're done, we're out. If you can't, we go back to training it again. Sometimes we're 4 sets in before the pop occurs. But once the pop occurs, you can see it in the graphs that I showed you. And again, we can do it with this. We can even start riddles, and we can play with games of riddles. In Oompa Land, elephants are smaller than mice. So in Oompa Land, which is smaller, the elephant or the mouse? You can just start to have fun with stories. You suddenly see how creative you can be about the ways that you can get this in interesting, novel ways. We have narratives about personal achievement, where the kids tell stories about what character they're going to be when they achieve certain results, so that they identify with. That's another presentation on interleaving, which is really cool. There is many ways you can test whether your hierarchies and your dialectics and your comparatives are working, that the child doesn't even necessarily know you're doing, but you are doing. But you also have the option of coming back and doing it very explicitly in the way I showed you, which is you start non-arbitrarily, you go and probe and test, test and train, test and train, test and train until you test and pass. And then you just go and use it. Okay. Now, what I've got some stuff here, guys, you can read it later. But if you're symbolic, now once you've got the frames, because I've been talking about these frames like they're all individual, and of course they stick together. Once you get these things all through, you find yourself doing an enormous amount of role play and pretend play and storytelling drills, where the child actually takes on a character, they video themselves and see if they actually presented the gesture that the character's meant to present. You can actually have a ball, because suddenly you can put this into narrative work that creates self-concept and self-awareness and sense of other within groups, which is, of course, the symbolic reality that we do. So, for example, we can in pretend play with coordination. I could say firefighters get a hose. These are the rules I would give the kids. Firefighters get a hose, the police get a squirt pistol, the doctors get the pretend needle that squirts. All of these are squirting guns of some sort. Guess who a person is from the item, and I just give them each item and they tell me who they are. It's a very basic coordination of I am the firefighter because I got a hose. Okay, who do you want to be? The child says, I want to be the police person, whatever the police. So, okay, then you should be able to know what item to go get, and they should go get it. Okay, but then I can do hierarchy with that. And I say, look, if you've got the pistol has to have these boots, whereas these boots belong to anyone who has the to the hose because they're bigger, and these shoes here for anyone who gets a needle. That's it. Now, the minute I do that, I should say, okay, now you're going to be the police. Which boots are yours? You've just now coordinated by category. The category of police is associated with. That's the A1 drill I told you about. Okay, so now you know the boots that go with the needle mean, and I want to be the doctor. So if I'm the doctor, I get the needle, which means I get those boots. And we've transformed functions through a network. I never shaped you, I never reinforced you. But I can change motivations. I can say the pistols will get more points than hoses for a direct hit because they're harder to aim. So I might give a reason. And we're aiming at targets. So whoever shoots the most accurate will get it. Now, what would you like to be? And I ask each child, the child goes, I want the pistol because the pistol is going to get more results. But I could say that the person who makes the biggest splash, the one that makes the biggest area on the wall, will get the most points because we're going to go for it's a big target. So whoever can cover the whole target. So the pistol will take 5 shots, or I can do a more or less relation. The pistol takes more shots than the needle. The needle takes more shots than the hose. Who wants what? Well, the smart move is go for the hose because it's going to take less shots. You can expand the C functions. If you have a firefighter, you always have to look determined. So we have drills where we play the same script out, but we put you in a different character, which means you have a different reaction to the person talking to you. You have a drill called Angry Shopkeeper, where you actually have to approach it when you're a shopkeeper. Someone asks for milk, but you don't want to give them milk. You're angry. You're an angry shopkeeper, or you're a happy shopkeeper, or you're a surprise shopkeeper, or you're a scared shopkeeper. And all we're asking you to do is, can you gesture in character of the shopkeeper? But then we say, actually, you're not the shopkeeper. Now you're going to be a policeman. Can you be a scared policeman? Which means you gesture, and then we video you and let you see it. And we let you see it because we know that the charades we did earlier, where we said, this is scared, can you identify me? Yes, you're scared. Well done, that's scared. Can you show me? No, I can't guess what you are. No. Sorry. Oh, is that scared? Yeah, that's scared. Yeah, I can get that. That's scared. So we agree that's called scared. But then I ask you to play a character and gesture, and I say, right, you're going to have to be a character and a gesture, and I have to guess. The child will go, whatever the policeman baton is, and the gesture, which is, he might do scared, you might go like this, and I go, you're a scared policeman, or you're a scared firefighter, or whatever. And I'm guessing it with a charades activity. So now he's learning to be aware of how that symbol predicts these realities. We can agree on those shared ones. And it's all pretend play. But I can measure it, and I know what I did to create it. And of course, these can be put into long stories with intent. We can get the ideas from YouTube and bring them across because that's a transmitter in the culture. All of these things are relational networks that we can measure, we can identify, and then we can start to get personal. So the child starts to know what a conversation does, knows what a prediction does, knows how to anticipate, but shows an awareness of it. So I've gone really fast, guys, because this is how I go. Hopefully the translator's kept up. If I was saying how RFTs changed how we look at things, this is how it looks. We rethink the prompt straight away, and we see prompts as information sources, and we look for transfer or transformation, and we try to get as socially and culturally available as possible, which is why hand over hand is a pretty awful one, because it's just not used much, and it doesn't transfer far, and it doesn't transform much. We try to get all the different types of information sources and the types as varied as we can, and we make symbolic prompting. We don't think of it as explanation as a skill. We think of explanation as a way to transform knowledge, to transfer knowledge, and then we're going to see if it worked. So we have what we would call symbolic prompting, and we measure accordingly. I know I've got to hang up really soon. We definitely look for all the attachment cues like joint attention, imitation, emotional and social cues that say I matter. So again, we don't use the prompt from a coercive, it's from a collaborative perspective. We don't measure for acquisition and generalization. We do actually, but once we've got the tool skills, we measure for generativity. We see coordination as absolutely pivotal, and we explode it in as many ways as we can. We always look at the physical context as an element, not as the end. So that's a great example. That's from, I can't remember who gave me that one, but it's in the notes. But that's a beautiful container metaphor for categorization. But once you've got that, we abstract it because we're never satisfied leaving everything in the physical world. We want to abstract the symbolic as quickly as we can. And we look at the culture as a cue. So a lot of our drills, we'd use YouTube. We include YouTube and we watch YouTube together and then we try to imitate it together. We put self in the drills. There is self in time and space. There's self in role in group, rules when you're playing a game, the dynamics of relationships, okay? And we then try to get a kid to self-talk, to visualize, to gesture to themselves in the way we did so that it becomes more deliberate and self-targeted because we know that's where the autonomy comes from. And that is a race towards the end. There is some more slides after this you can have, but that is the end of my how RFT looks in an ABA program. I hope that was useful.